Sure, I think we can give you a second to get settled, Lyle.
Yeah, there's some people still coming in.
Got no scheduled endpoint, so.
Feel better,
We
thank you very much.
can do a little bit of
We have all the
logistics.
counselors present. I don't know how you all feel.
Just from a logistics standpoint, this is gonna be a work session format, and so we won't have any verbal public feedback. We will take written feedback. We have pens and cards in the back for folks that want to provide that. I understand some folks in the room have a paper that they would like to provide as well. And then any emails that come my way per the instructions during the meeting time will also be attached to the minutes of this activity. And so as soon as we compile those from tonight, we'll send those both to City Council and Planning Commission. So you all have all of those comments as well.
Good afternoon, borderline evening, everybody. So we have effectively a two-part meeting. Our first part, we're going to talk about the residential A, B, and C districts in particular, which we've had a lot of different conversations on. Hoping that we can clarify a lot of points today, and I know there's a number of things for discussion on that. We have for that part of the meeting, our consultant team all together up in the top right corner of our screen. I'll let them introduce themselves when they come on, and they'll have a presentation for us, and then we can move into discussion of that. And then the second part of the meeting will be to talk about module 3. And then if there are other questions or topics that folks would like to take up, I'm happy to do so at that point. We can call that the third part.
Let's just do 2 parts.
That's fair enough. If there's any questions for me before we get started, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I will be kicking it over to our team from Code Studio. Nothing? Awesome. All right, turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, James. Can y'all hear me okay?
And we need to be able to hear them.
This room seems to be a magic. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't.
Oh, Christy, we can't hear you quite yet.
I'll keep talking occasionally.
I thought we had some communications.
Well, they were down here earlier, but that.
It's still lighting up. It's lighting up.
You see the participant panel?
It's not that they're muted.
Yeah, I think it's here.
Now go
That's the
to.
stuff.
You can keep talking.
Gives us any sound options.
Test.
Not that mute. This mute down here in the bottom left corner, the little carrot.
Here. This
Little
one?
up arrow thing. Click on the up arrow, not the mute button.
Would you like to try?
Sure.
Thank you.
This is good.
Testing.
I don't look at that.
It's quite a speaker system over there.
Yeah.
Speaker phone.
Oh,
There you go, Tom.
it's on Zoom.
There we go. And I think any screens that are open in the room should be muted so that we don't get the feedback.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can
I
hear
got a
you.
thumbs up. Great.
A little echoey.
Can you guys not hear us?
We can hear you.
Okay.
All right, so let's mute our screen.
Okay. You want me to, I'll keep going. Does that sound good? Seems like it's working pretty well. Ish?
No.
No? Can you hear me now? Nope. I think the room is muted.
Yeah, we're not hearing Lyle or anybody.
Yeah. Keep
Correct.
testing. Ooh, I hear you now. Can you hear me?
Do you guys have more than one? We're just trying to deal with the feedback issue.
Okay.
Do you guys have more than one Zoom window open?
No.
Okay. Can we tolerate the feedback?
I can.
It's not terrible.
Okay, then let's go forward.
You'll hear all the things we say echoing in your mind for a while. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen really quickly, and we just want to go through some quick illustrations that we did that will help facilitate some of the conversations that you all are already having around bulk and mass and how those compare to what your existing regulations today allow versus what some of the proposed are, how they differ, and talk about some of the dials that we may want to fine tune as we're talking about the residential district. So that's sort of the context setting. Yes, Lyle. Can you, I saw a hand raised. We good? Oh, we can't hear you. I think the room is muted. He said what?
Slow down.
We can't hear you. Are we, am I good to keep going? Okay. I'm gonna keep going then.
Sorry, Chris, just the problem is where the feedback is getting a little overwhelming. If you could just talk a little slower, I think that will help.
Okay.
Might help if you guys mute like the speakers on your computer while you talk. I know that's a little weird, but we'll wave at you if we want you to.
Okay.
listen to us.
Yeah, wave at me, and Lee has a text notification with James, so if worst comes to worst, then send that message. All right, speakers off. Can I get a thumbs up if that's any better? Thumbs down. Okay, I will keep going more slowly. All right, can I get a thumbs up if you can see this screen? Thumbs up, great. Okay, so again, I'm gonna go through these pretty quickly. These are essentially two sets of lots. One, a set of visualizations on a 6,000 square foot lot. So it's just a pretty standard lot size for what you have today, 50 by 120. And then what would be considered a double lot. So if you weren't subdividing and you just had a double sized lot, what are some of the outcomes and how would they look? So those are the two sizes we'll look at. And you'll see throughout this presentation on the left-hand side are the regulations as you have them today. And on the right side, as they're currently proposed, of course, in draft form, and that's going to be part of the discussion of how we want to tweak those dials. A couple other things I do just want to point out early on. These illustrations only represent they show the maximum build out without including a lot of other standards that would pare back the actual size of the building. What I mean by that is if you include parking, tree canopy. So the requirements to get those tree canopy would pare back the size of the building, getting your stormwater requirements, paring back the size of the building, taking into account topography. All of those things would make the buildable area of the lot shrink.
Put it in the chat. Put it in the chat.
Got some waving hands.
Nope.
Maybe chat what the issue is. I'll turn my speaker off.
Okay.
It does say echo canceling speakerphone. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
But that kind of sounds like our echo.
Where is it?
Talk again.
All right, is this better?
That's our microphone, so that's our.
All right, talk again.
Any better now?
No,
Try the middle one.
This is where we start.
that's where it wasn't working, right? Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Go to audio.
Okay, right.
Yeah, can we get comms down here? The attorneys are on us. Oh, yeah, just phone.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, have them just call.
Like the thing that works.
Audio settings.
Go to audio settings.
Go to audio settings. There you go. That's where it's happening.
You aren't IT, are you? Are you IT? Oh, that's terrible. But thank you.
Does it sound any better?
I'm trying to get some people who might be able to help.
Yeah.
There's a number of meetings going on, that's why we don't have people here.
So I think the strategy of having Code Studio dial in with their phones seems like a good one to me. If
You want us to
guys-
call? We'll call in.
Yeah, switch off computer audio and then,
Okay.
um,
I think it's on.
We might also consider moving around the agenda a little bit until we can get this nailed down.
Do you want to try calling in really quickly?
yeah, give it a shot.
There.
Thank you for not normally scheduling us in this room.
I will say that I had a meeting in here that was partially zoomed and we had the same issue. And
In this
we were defeated.
room? Oh. What is the room called?
Oh, Remy's coming.
Yeah,
He's-
but
he's
Brian
running
eventually
from-
descended
The other meeting.
and spent 20 minutes beating his head against it.
We can- I mean, we can just have leave call.
Yeah.
Phone, and we can talk through my phone.
That's
And then
an option.
Turn off all the sound.
speakers. Yeah, or if they Zoom, they look like a Zoom phone call. Circa 2005.
So we call
Yeah.
him. Would it at least work?
So I think they're trying to call in, so we might wanna check the participants then.
What's that?
It seems like,
They're trying to call.
oh, they're
James.
calling him.
No, no,
directly.
I don't know. if
I
I'm
feel like
doing that, but I
Trying with
think-
Zoom is probably the better
Yeah,
first
they're
option.
26, they just
That might be
popped
done.
I'm sorry. They just popped up, so go to green.
No, no phones.
Go back to panel.
It's so good to see you. We're having audio troubles.
Let's see anything.
Just the rest of you.
I'm pretty sure it's on a CBAC.
Oh,
level.
Oh,
she is.
there we go.
Nope.
CAC
Okay.
level.
So Remy, we're getting a whole bunch of feedback when they talk. When she's handing us her seat.
Okay.
Just real quick.
Uh,
That's where we started.
we're not getting any audio on that.
It may be physically shut off.
That's an interesting.
You need somebody to talk.
Well, can you promote her with her hand raised?
The rebuild back better bill could have fixed this.
If
Is this any
someone-
better?
Bottom of everything.
Keep talking for me, please.
Can you hear us now?
Still echoing.
It's a little echoey.
Still echoey. Any better?
I'll keep going.
Okay. How's this sounding? I'm gonna go to the next slide. Is that better?
Is there a way to
Us.
turn, is that turned off, maybe?
Okay, try it now.
Any better now?
Christie?
Yes.
She's talking.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Up and down.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Any better?
No.
Can you hear us?
Yes, can hear you very well.
Oh, it just doesn't.
One more time.
I demand a refund.
Ah,
James, an unideal but reasonable way, if you do want to open with this, I just sent this presentation to Missy. As an, I know you, would it work better if you just tried to speak to the slides and we could chime in if needed?
It's two different speakers.
That's what it
So
sounds
this
like.
is
does
not
something like
connected. There's no connection here.
If the conference room, if the dog in the conference room. what's it doing? Go into that number. And then put it on speaker.
You could just do the audio through the phone and keep everything turned off and just do the audio through the phone.
Could
Talk
use
for me
these
real quick.
speakers for your phone to make it louder.
Do you want us to keep talking occasionally, just to test?
Yeah.
We can do that.
I think we can just switch to a phone.
Somebody did suggest just hanging up and dialing back in. Did we try that?
We tried that.
And there's not a speakerphone in the room.
Talk for me real quick.
You mean
Let's try to
us?
figure out where the audio.
Is this any better?
Just a conference.
How is this sounding?
I'm just trying to speak through it right now.
It's a little
They just dial that number on that conference room phone.
They tried that after Zoom wasn't working directly, so. It sounds like it's on there. Plus, apparently it's happened in this room before.
And were you pointing out, it seems to be coming from the back two speakers?
I did hear sound coming.
Audible speaker.
Oh, I mean, they're on, just depends on how aggressive. you want to
This is
be.
a television, right? Is there just a speaker associated with that television without these four speakers?
There you go.
Turn off the TV screen.
Don't worry, Mike charges a very reasonable rate.
That's, now we're talking.
Possibly that's not muted or?
That's interesting.
Just checking, is that sounding any better?
Hold on. Now talk.
Talk again?
Sounding, how is this sounding?
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Wow. Great.
Beginning. We hope that gets our item on the agenda under discussion. Thank you.
I'm gonna try one other thing. I'm gonna,
We're good.
okay, I'm not gonna touch anything then. We'll use our phone and computer and we'll be good to go.
Just keep talking.
Nobody breathe.
Get rid of the participants list.
Yeah, can we close that?
Was my point heard at all that
No.
this is, okay, no, okay, nothing was heard, okay.
Nothing was.
So,
No, nothing was heard. It was very much.
point taken.
Some of
Um,
this.
So I'll set the stage really quickly. We essentially set up some visualizations of a 6,000 square foot lot and then what would be considered a double lot. So not subdivided if you were just to keep the lot at a double size lot. So these are the two scenarios we tested, and to give everybody a bit of orientation, everything that you see on the left-hand side is what would be allowed under today's standards from a bulk and mass perspective and how those elements are being controlled. And then on the right-hand side would be how we're proposing the regulations in the draft. And of course, that's part of the discussion today of how we may want to tweak those dials to, arrive at the outcome that make the most sense. So I do want to point out a couple of other things. This purely is looking at the bulk and mass standards of the zoning district. So a lot of other elements that have to be considered when building a development would shrink the buildable area. Things like tree canopy requirements, stormwater requirements, any topography, critical slopes, driveways, access, getting parking on the site. So I do just want to emphasize we are truly modeling the maximum building envelope, but want to be very clear that all of those other elements would functionally shrink what could be built feasibly on site. So want to make sure that's clear up front. To give everyone a bit of orientation, we're going to look at that single lot first. So that 50 by 120, your sort of minimum lot size today, your 6,000 square foot lot. So from a setbacks perspective, you have a 25-foot front setback, a 25-foot rear setback, and a 5-foot side in your existing standards. And these regulations that we're modeling in the proposed follow the existing draft for RA. So in RA, we have the 10-foot minimum, 20-foot maximum, or existing range. So, there's a bit of variation in that front, a 4-foot side, and a 4-foot rear. So what does that mean? What that means is when you're thinking about how you're controlling for building size and building location, in today's regulations, the setbacks and the height are the only tools, the only dials that impact that bulk and mass. In the proposed regulation, we have a few more dials. And so I want to make sure that we understand what those dials do and how we can change them to get the outcomes that we may want to see. And so building location, that's what your setbacks control. So you can't build all the way maximum to all the setbacks because you have other dials that restrict it. The setbacks say where the building can go on site. As far as the building size, the bulk and mass of that building, and the new regulations would be controlled with building width, your building height, and that building coverage requirement. So that it sort of breaks apart those dials and gets at building location and building size in a bit more nuanced of a way. And what we're going to show in these illustrations is how the ultimate outcome of the buildings can be more fine-tuned when you break those dials apart. So let's take a look at, for example, today, what you can build with a primary plus attached accessory unit versus what will be proposed for a 2-unit in R-A. So you can build to your maximum setbacks at 35 feet high, which is about 3 stories. There aren't story requirements in your current code, but just to give you an idea. And so that results in a 40-foot wide building. And then in the proposed regulations, it's a 2.5 story requirement. So you can see that that roof comes down a bit and there's a building width. So you can see the width scoots in. So what does that mean from a development footprint perspective? It means that in today's building size, you can get to a building that's about a 2,800 square foot building footprint, but is a bit taller of a building. So it gets to ultimately a building that's about 8,400 square feet. The maximum you could build. Under the proposed, you can see that that mass gets skinnier, but it gets a bit longer. And I do want to just emphasize something you'll see throughout these drawings. You can see the difference in the building width and setbacks. I think this does a good job in illustrating that building width really is part of what helps control for that sort of rhythm that defines house scale. And it's an important tool in how we think about that. So even as the buildings may get a bit deeper, and if they have more units in them, they still have that house feel from the street. And the width is a really key way that we help ensure that that rhythm is maintained. So I wanted to emphasize that. The side setbacks also help give some flexibility for things like rear access, whether it's a sidewalk or a driveway. So the building can sort of scoot to one side or the other. It's also a great way to do tree preservation. If you have a big, beautiful existing tree that's on a boundary line, you can scoot that building over to one of the side setbacks to help stay out of that critical root zone. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly just to illustrate how some lot coverage, for example, the dial turns depending on how many units you have. So if you bump up to a 4-unit, you can see that that back building sort of shifts back a little bit because you get a bit more building coverage allowance in the current proposal, in the proposed draft. When you go up to 4 units, today's regulations stay the same. So what does that mean? It means your building footprint gets a bit deeper, and your building footprint, your building size. So when you multiply this building footprint by 2.5, then your building size, the most you could ever build would be about 9,000 square feet. And then finally for 8 units, and I will say it would be very, very challenging to build this. These are very skinny units, but just to illustrate, once again, that coverage, you can see increases even further, and the allowance of the proposed, and ultimately that building footprint would end up being something like 37,000 square feet, with a building size of about 3,700. I'm sorry, not 37,000. So partially what we really wanted to show is the difference in how building width makes the building placement and the feel along the street change, show how the building coverage as you get more units, that little bit of calibration, how that changes and what effect that could have. So I wanted to offer that up. And then also what the 2.5 story means as far as feel and the height. So when you go from a 3 story to a 2.5, what the bulk and mass implications of that could be. So wanted to offer that as consideration. I'll pause briefly. It's the same exercise we went through for the double lots. I think the double lot illustrates it maybe in an even more extreme way of how the building width especially controls for that building scale across the front. But I'll pause briefly if anybody has any questions before I move on. Keep going.
Hopefully it'll become clearer.
You're very small. I think I saw a hand raise.
Nope.
No.
You keep going.
Nope. Keep going. Okay. You're small in the corner. Okay. So again, this is going to a double lot. So this is assuming that somebody would not subdivide a parcel. Obviously you could, somebody could, but let's just say it's just a larger lot and someone wanted to leave it that way. So we still have the same setbacks, 25-foot front, 25-foot rear in your existing regulations, a 5-foot side. And then for the proposed regulations, that 10-foot minimum, 20-foot maximum, or existing, do want to emphasize that, 4-foot side and 4-foot rear setback. So what are the outcomes? What I think is fairly obvious immediately is that particularly with wide lots, that building width becomes very important. So you can see that this building under today's standard, if you had a 100-foot wide lot, you could build a 90-foot wide building. Obviously that doesn't happen very often, but it's something you could do. Whereas even though you have a very wide lot in the proposed draft, you still have to maintain that more narrow building width that conforms more to that house scale. So what does that mean from a footprint and building size outcome? You can see that the building footprints are fairly close in this example. So you have the 6,300 for the existing and the proposed, it's 6,600. But from a building size perspective, the square footage that you can get is significantly more actually in the current regulations, and it has to do with that full 3rd story. So it's almost 19,000 square feet that you could build today, whereas under their proposed standards would be more like 16,500. And that's for 2 units, because again, that building size and that building footprint in the proposed is really being calibrated by building width, also that building coverage. So that's a new tool that doesn't exist in your ordinance. You can see how that bumps up a little bit once you get to 4 stories. So you get a bit more coverage allowed. So it allows you to get up to 4 units. It allows you to get up to 7,200 footprint. Whereas the existing would be a 6,300, and your building size is still larger in your existing regulations. So the building size that would be allowed under the proposed would be about 18,000 square feet. And then finally, to close the loop with 8 units, again, that getting that bit more coverage with the more units that we're allowing. The building footprint gets closer to 7,500. But the building size from a total square footage perspective is still less than what you would see today. So wanted to really point your attention to, how that building width really impacts the feel of the development from the street in particular, and how we can use that in conjunction with building coverage to think about what the scale of the building is as it goes deeper into the lot. Any questions about this? I have one other slide that shifts topics a bit, but I know it's something that's important to talk about, and that's the alternative forms, in particular the RA, RB, and RC. I'll go ahead and shift to that. So for the alternative forms, something that we are working on and that you all have an opportunity to see when we release the consolidated draft is more detail and a couple fixes for the alternative forms of what uses are allowed and what those forms ultimately end up becoming. So the one in particular that I want to highlight is the shop front house alternative form. And the intent of this really runs the spectrum from something that is a house, it looks like a house, it's the form of a house, but it has a business. So this is actually an example of just down the street from us here in Austin. And it's a a restaurant now. It's in an old house and they've essentially created a patio and built out to commercial kitchen, but fundamentally it's a house form. The next sort of iteration of that would be allowed with that alternative form is the shop front house, and that's more of an addition to an existing house. And some people call those accessory commercial, neighborhood commercial, but it really is accessory that is added onto that existing house form, sort of in front of it. It's what you think of when someone typically says a shop front house form. And then the more historic corner store of what you would think that doesn't have necessarily the form or shape of a house, and it really just occupies that corner, maybe in a more flat roof form. But that would also be a form that could be built under the alternative form of a shop front house. So that would kind of run the spectrum of least intervention of looks like a house, feels like a house, to something that looks and feels a bit more like a neighborhood scale commercial building. So one thing that we are working through and would love to get you all's feedback on are some of the use standards that we're associating with this. So one of the key standards that we do want to highlight is that this use in our A, B, and C would be limited to corner lots. So they're historically found in corners, so making them a corner lot form makes sense. They are limited in size. We've broken down the use table into up to 4,000 square feet and beyond 4,000 square feet. So that is an important threshold. Most of these do require a special use permit, so there's a process associated with that. And these are most limited in RA. So things like food and beverage would not be allowed in RA. Only retail, we're in the draft currently proposing that it would be a special use permit. And the only things that would be allowed by right are small, like personal service offices, small medical uses like that, where it's more of like, think of an attorney's office that is in a house form, that 1 or 2 employee personal service kind of use. And then the allowances would increase from there into RB and RC. So I do want to highlight those, give a bit more detail into that. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know it's going to be part of the discussion. Another thing I do want to emphasize with this are all of the other development standards associated with this, including where parking can be located. So these all have to be very neighborhood scale, pulled up to the street, pedestrian oriented. Parking would have to be located behind, it would have to be screened. So these are all meant to be very neighborhood and pedestrian oriented uses, and not auto oriented uses. Make sure that was clear with the intent of these neighborhood scale commercial buildings. And that was it for the slides we have. Happy to answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Happy to jump in and pull up a specific slide if we need to, but it lets us see you a bit better when I can turn the screen share off.
So are we, for those 3 options that are alternative forms, is it either or all of what are our options with that?
The way it is currently written, all 3 of these are possible. So you can build something that is a house scale business, a shop front house, or a corner store. That is all possible under the current standards that are being proposed for the shop front house alternative form.
Thank you.
And when you say it's limited to corner lots, do you mean all 3 of these forms or just the corner store?
All
Like
of them.
all of the uses that would go into these forms?
That's right. All of the uses. Yeah. So the way the alternative forms work is essentially to say, if this use is allowed, then it can use this alternative form. It's allowed to use that alternative form. And so when you go look at the use standard of those uses, so take general commercial under 4,000 square feet, part of that use standard will say has to be located on a corner lot in the R districts.
So does that mean that you could not have a business use one of these 3 alternative forms in the middle of a block?
That's the current proposal of the draft, yeah. And that's for all of the commercial uses that, we've just said that as a starting point. There are different use groups in there, so general retail is different from an impact perspective from personal service. And so it may be that we want to keep certain of those uses like retail or food and beverage to corner, but maybe the personal services are okay mid-block. And so we could modify the standards so that those would be allowed mid-block. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, so just for further clarification for me, when you were describing it before, you said that there'll be no food or alcohol, and then you referred to kind of personal business services. So could there be like a small store that, you could get milk and things like that? Or will you just, can you clarify that, what you meant by that?
Yeah, so we have a couple different use categories, and those define what is or isn't included in that. So those use categories can include food and beverage, which is, for sale, for consumption, on-site, food and beverage, alcohol included. So that is more limited in where that is allowed and whether it needs a special use permit than general retail. So what you're describing, that's more like a corner store, bodega kind of situation, that would be allowed to sell some of those things on site, but not for on-site consumption.
Right.
That's more food and beverage. So each of those use categories are defined separately and allowances given to them according to their general impact.
Do we generally kind of think that the proprietors of these businesses would live on that same lot?
Maybe they don't, in the draft proposal, they don't have to. Not a requirement.
If you think about these in a continuum, so the very first level of commercial use in a residential district is a home-based business, right? And that's where the commercial use is accessory, and the proprietor lives on site. And right now, that set of rules is limited to strictly professional uses for the most part. There's a couple service uses that are allowed in that space as well. And then this is kind of that next phase up where it creates the opportunity to expand out a more overtly commercial space.
Lyle here, can you talk about gas stations and alleyways?
No gas stations.
Yeah, gas stations would not be allowed under this use,
Thank you.
period. I'm not sure the question about alleyways specifically. No,
Do alleyways form a corner or are they treated as a separate entity?
it would have to be a corner of streets. An alley is not considered a street.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes.
I believe
Yeah, but gas stations would not be allowed. Fueling stations are a separate use that is not allowed under this at all.
I believe you said these examples were for what would be allowed in RA, and that RA is the most restrictive zone. Can you just go over the differences between what's permitted in RB and RC versus RA in terms of having less limitations in those zones?
Yes, and I can pull up, well, I may need to reference it, but I can talk generally about it. In RA, food and beverage, in the draft, we're proposing that would not be allowed in RA, whereas it would be allowed for a special use permit in RB and RC. So it would have to go through that special use permit process. General retail, I believe, is a special use permit in all of the R districts, A, B, and C, so it's possible, but again, does have to go through the special use permit process. And then personal services and general medical, that are those smaller, under 4,000 square feet. That's the instance in all of these. Those would be permitted, and these all have use standards associated with them. I can verify, but off the top of my head, that's the general spectrum. The biggest difference is food and beverage and what requires a special use permit and what does not.
So you didn't mention lodging. Have we already agreed to get rid of that? I think everyone's
Lodging is
on the same page.
out of RA completely and by special permit in the RB and the RC, and that is topped out at 10 rooms.
It's in what?
10 rooms, 10 guest rooms.
So like a bed and breakfast, but only by special use permit.
A bed and breakfast, that's right.
General medical is allowed in the RA, and that's, you're thinking, well, like a dentist office or like a.
That's right. Physical therapy. Very small scale, you know, kind of doctor.
4,000 square feet is kind of. 4,000 square feet could be a decent sized medical office.
It's huge.
We obviously all understand special use permits in that process, just as like a practical administratively in terms of the process, how it plays out. What is that non-special use permit process? What would that look like for those other uses, just in terms of like how that comes into the city, how it's evaluated, approved or not?
That would be evaluated under the typical development review process. And so the planning team would be checking to make sure all of those use standards would be adhered to. And those use standards being in Article 3. So that application would come in and James and his team would go through and make sure that all of those standards are checking the boxes. It's in the appropriate places, that it's an allowed use, that's an appropriate size. And then either approved or disapproved.
Right, and then the only other thing to add in there is depending on the level of actual construction activity, whether it triggers site plan review.
Most everything requires a development plan for this code.
Right.
But non-discretionary even at the administrative level.
The special use permit, we're looking at just whether it be a nuisance or not. I mean, what type of, how discretionary can we be with that, or subjective, I guess.
Christie.
Do you want me to answer that, James?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, or I can. Because I
Yeah,
can't see you, I don't know if you're about to talk. So I don't know what I'm talking about.
You can go ahead, James.
Okay, so I mean, it's like your existing process. The special use permit defines a set of criteria against which you guys are making a call as to whether it meets or does not meet those criteria.
Mhm. So we would need to develop those criteria.
Well, but it's a not limited to list, right? So you can just say any other adverse impact is a reason to deny it or to add conditions.
Yeah, I mean, it's this, I think it's the same list. You guys didn't propose any changes to the criteria from what we have, right?
There's some reduction
There was some, the attorney
there. but-
reviewed.
Oh, from the city, all right, yeah.
She did some, we had the attorney look at that criteria specifically because it is so integral to state law. And she recommended some reduction just based on her review of that.
Guess where I'm going with this is, I mean, it's a leading question. If we were to allow these on all lots, not just corner lots, but we've got the SUP process to kind of moderate that. I mean, how easy is it for us to say, well, this is going to be a nuisance versus this is, appropriate?
And the special use process is set up to mitigate or ameliorate or prevent nuisance. I mean, it's fundamental level.
Okay.
So, yeah.
But is the SUP process, does the SUP process permit us to say there are already two others like this on the block and you don't get one? Because you're third in line and you weren't one of the first two.
It would be best if we had a criteria that said something similar to that we were going to look at the question of spacing as one of the criteria. I would also say, I caution you as to how much zoning can really do about the success of a given business. So we all know that some named bakeries would be packed and some slightly more no-name bakeries might be really quiet, even though they're embedded in a neighborhood. And that has to do with, the quality of what they're selling, et cetera. So there is some nuance to this, and that's why the special use permit is really important for things that you are concerned about whether they would have significant impacts. I think that we, for the most part, know about the impacts that might come with any dentist, any doctor. There are certain periods of time that are sort of necessary to manage a patient. You can't pump them through there any quicker. Whereas, food service and some other kinds of things maybe are a little more iffy. And therefore, the special use is a way to talk with the applicant to maybe find out where they have other similar businesses, if they do, some of those kinds of things that would really help you make the decision.
But emphasize the point that Lee made, that to the extent that we can identify specific criteria or specific issues that we're concerned about, we put those in as criteria for considerations for the special use permit. So if we're concerned about the number, then we list that straight up. That's the number in a given block or the density of the particular use, we identify that as a criteria.
That we also have the ability to add more standards if there's something that makes a lot of sense to apply to those just as a standard to that specific use. So in our districts, for example, if 4,000 square feet feels too big for medical, there can be a use standard that says general medical 4,000 and under is limited to 2,000 square feet in the R districts. So those standards can be associated with the specific use, whether it's permitted and reviewed administratively or going through a special use permit. Those criteria still have to be met.
So, but I mean, the law says potential adverse impacts to be considered include, but are not necessarily limited to the following. So it's not like we have to figure out every possible adverse impact and put it in the list now, or we can't
Right.
deny on that.
I agree
basis.
with that statement. I'm simply saying that if there are things we know now,
We
the
can put them
extent that we can share that information in advance makes it better for everybody.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But if there's some unforeseen,
Right.
externality when you get 4 dentists on a block.
We don't have to foresee everything.
Can you guys, sorry, please.
How does that person who wants to do catering out of their home business, which category do they fall in?
That's a home-based business.
But there might be a scale at which it becomes something more like this.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Lee.
What was the rationale in terms of like the use of SUPs being much more extensive in RA, whereas way more uses are by right in RB and RC?
It mostly had to do with the orientation of RB and RC along more corridors and adjacent to amenity areas. And, that was something that was thought about in the comp plan process and that mapping process. So it seemed to make more sense because those naturally tended to be on either slightly larger streets or closer to amenities, places that were starting to feel like neighborhood centers that could accommodate those a bit more readily.
Can you address vape shops? I'm getting a lot of questions about vape shops.
Any specific questions or issues about them?
How would they be regulated or considered?
Vape is just a
Oh,
thing
vape.
you happen to sell. So, if the state's allowing you to sell it, we'd have to ask the attorney whether we can allow, whether we can constrain it. But it is possible that we could have, spacing or other concerns associated with vape. We would be talking to the city's attorney before we set up anything like that. But yes, there are certain uses that have those kinds of standards, and you could have that use more restricted, I believe, but I don't know Virginia law well enough to be able to really opine on that.
This is Truman, and obviously you're working with Ms. Pandak, but my gut reaction is that you can, and I would suggest that you chat with Ms. Pandak about that issue, please.
Happy to.
Thank you.
And so the point there is that if there's specific subcategories of retail, essentially, they could be more heavily restricted. Lee, I don't know if everyone caught it, like you can do by distance rules, distance from certain other uses or whatever. And I presume you could also take those subcategories of retail and just exclude them from certain districts.
They could be banned, yes.
Would it not reach a point if we're getting into that level of specificity where it almost makes more sense to be making more expansive use of special use permits?
Potentially, I think we had felt that a number of these things are a bit of a no-brainer. A special use permit is difficult for an applicant to go through. And if you see these as a baby step up from a home-based business to something slightly larger that might eventually grow into something even larger, it's a real challenge to go through that formal process. So if you really want to experiment and get corner stores, we would recommend, or corner uses, we'd recommend that you allow some things by right and try it out for a bit and see if you're comfortable with it. If in fact you're finding you have nuisance issues that need to be managed, either we need more standards for the uses even when they're by right, or we need that special use permit process. So I would be reluctant to throw everything in that pot, but certainly anything that you're leery about. I mean, frankly, number one on my personal list would be a coffee shop. Number two might be a small corner store. Do I want the corner store to be filled with vape products and I don't know, you probably can't sell the lottery in Virginia, but that would also be, you know, the next target. Yes, I agree. There are some things that you might want to leave out. This is an experiment for you. You don't really have a major pattern of historic versions of this, in spite of the fact that clearly they were there at one point in time in some of the neighborhoods. And as you bring it back, you should probably be a little bit careful about it for sure.
So, I think one dial that could be turned for that is like that square footage cutoff, right? Like right now it's 4,000 square feet for the general retail and for medical, which is a big medical office and a big retail thing. And thinking about our corner stores around town, I don't know their square footage. The data quality is terrible, but I assume it's a lot less than that. And so one way to be careful seems like it would be, only allowing them to be small, and then if there were a nuisance, it would be restricted by the scale. It would be half as big or whatever. Where'd you guys come up with why 4,000? Is that because the current code says 4,000?
We generally found that in most communities, it's a pretty good cutoff of being able to allow enough, but keeps a lot of the any sort of big box retailer out of any of those uses. So it just made sense as a cutoff. A lot of local businesses want something that could be divided into maybe two smaller 2,000 square foot storefronts. But that's really the maximum they need. And it keeps it small and local without tipping into the more corporate.
So would 2,000 square foot storefronts count as one 4,000 square foot retail use, or two 2,000 square foot retail uses?
In this case, we'd be looking at a maximum for the site. So like that corner store image could be two uses there. It would need another door on the left, but that could be two uses rather than one. But it's really the scale of the building, the scale of the uses in the building that, and therefore on the single lot, that would be counted. So if you had a very large corner lot, you still would not be exceeding 4,000. You'd be better off putting residential on the other portion.
I guess one of the things that I'm grappling with here is that I can't decide whether I would want one of these stores to succeed or to fail. It seems to me that the neighbors would probably rather that any such business not do terribly well, because doing well means more traffic, means more noise, means more disruption to the neighborhood. But from a planning standpoint, I'm kind of grappling with this in part because it seems to me that we as planners ought to figure that we want whatever use we're going to authorize there to work. But the reality is, as I understand the logic of these sorts of stores, is if you're thinking that they're not going to be auto-oriented and therefore they're only going to be walk-in traffic or largely walk-in traffic or largely walk-in and bike-in or whatever, what's the likelihood, as I think about some of the places that we've tried to designate for that kind of use, what's the likelihood that you're gonna have a population density that is gonna be sufficient to do that? And therefore, is it not most likely that despite our expression of we want it to not be auto-oriented, that people are gonna have to drive there?
I think, you know, you can have people drive to a place without necessarily generating more traffic if it's the commercial real estate brokers are a term for this, but you know, they're stopping by on their way by anyway, right? You're driving home to your neighborhood, you turn up Grove Road, you stop for a second at the store and grab a gallon of milk. And you know, I would not be so absolute in saying that everyone doesn't want this thing near them. At the B&R market on Bowling and Avon, someone bought a $400,000 house last year that they tore down. It was like decrepit. It's a $400,000 lot next to a corner store. So it can't be that bad of a nuisance or an externality. Though people definitely do drive there and stop by for a moment.
I think the other thing in here is there's still gonna be an inherent limitation on the commercial viability of the site. As the success grows of a given site and neighborhood, what I would anticipate is that property owner now, as the success of their business grows, they're gonna change locations.
Unless they don't want to take on a mortgage.
Unless they don't want to take on a mortgage.
They want to stay there and be busy.
And be busy, but there's gonna be inherent limitation because they aren't gonna be able to build out a large parking lot. They're not gonna be able to expand their footprint. They've got a little footprint, they've got the space they have to work with, and so they'd have to at some point say, I accept this level of business. This is as much as I can do here. But the trade-off here when we're in this regulatory realm is do we want to create this opportunity or not? What this space offers potential for is more affordable entrepreneurial space, where somebody theoretically then is moving on to more established commercial corridors where their business will get better and better as their success grows.
To your other point, Mayor, in terms of like preference, I think one of the difficulties is I'm sure it depends a ton about what the specific business moving in is, as well as the specific site. I mean, there's definitely people I've canvassed and talked to who wish they had a corner store or a coffee shop they could walk to, and we do have examples of that in the city. At the same time, it's definitely true there would be areas of the city where I'm sure the neighborhood would not welcome some particular use coming in, but I don't know if the special use permit process is a way to kind of navigate it, but I would be uncomfortable just a blanket saying like, it is just illegal and absolutely not possible to have like some commercial uses mixed in with residential, because we see there is a real desire for that in areas of the community.
I think you'd also find that a lot of these would be run by, the homeowner who lives there already in something more of like a passion project kind of way, where like, it probably it's never going to pencil for a like corporate 7-Eleven to like say, I want to open up or a Starbucks to say, I want to open up, in the middle of a residential neighborhood. But for someone who lives there and wants to set up, a couple cafe tables and get, an espresso machine to be social, to bring together the community, they're obviously already paying their mortgage. They're not like the cost. The P&L is not, as rigorous, right? And that's kind of where the limited corner lots thing scares me, because, I think mostly you're not going to see a lot of these, right? The ones because the bank's not going to finance it. You're going to see people who want to do it on their own. I'm thinking of a Nextdoor post a couple of years ago that was like an immigrant who was like cooking all this stuff and was like, I'd love to bring it to people. I would love to have like a 4-table restaurant in my living room. I don't know how that works with health codes, but like that would be, that wouldn't be possible under the current zoning, obviously. I assume they weren't on a corner, And they're not gonna move to a corner to make that happen, because they already have their house.
We also consider you sort of snuggled up to this in your low barrier to entry for certain businesses. And the opportunity for economic activity there, you know, for something like a detailer, a young man youngster who lives in mom and dad's house, do a little detail shopping shop or a small beauty parlor or something like that. That's a very low barrier to entry, but that will generate substantial revenue. So, you know, I think in terms of firing entrepreneurial behavior with an incidental tax base for that, I mean, I think that's a net good. You gotta start somewhere.
And I understand the point that was offered about the special use permits, and I'm not saying everything should be, but I mean, I'm open to expanding that use to a greater extent in RB and RC, just in recognition that I think it is fair that there are some unpredictable uses that could come in that may not be wanted or don't fit, you know, in a particular context, that are allowed basically by right at this point, which then there's unpredictability to it.
Or is there another class of special use permit that is?
There's only one class of.
James, is what they're proposing here, is that what's in the?
No, it's in the latest draft. That was, that probably should have been clarified when she was describing this.
A draft that we have not yet seen.
Yeah, it's in the draft that we just received and are in the process of reviewing.
I see, okay. Because what we have now, the draft of the draft,
Yeah.
doesn't say you just have to be at corners.
I, of course, don't know of any secret businesses that are breaking zoning rules in Charlottesville. They don't exist. They don't exist. But if they did, it is possible that we might get more tax revenue if there was a legal place for them.
Yes.
If they didn't have to hide.
Well,
If they didn't have to hide.
and if we handled that with a little elegance instead of beating up on freelance writers in the county, for example.
They might even, you know, meet health codes instead of selling burgers out of their apartment on
What
Ridge.
was it that generated? What was it that predicated this switch, just feedback that they had heard?
This draft is the one that's coming out of the feedback we've received to date. Right? So it's trying to address concerns about the commercial uses in residential.
My view is if there's a way to handle this with a special use permit versus being so restrictive that you can only do this on corners is what we should do. A corner could be just as problematic to someone as putting it in the middle of a block. One of the things that I appreciated about the write-up that I guess you did, James, speaking to what used to be the case a long time ago, apparently, and I think this is kind of makes sense and was a good thing, that it's a shame that we lost. People used their location, their property to basically live in it and also have some kind of business, and that helped them build equity, helped them build a life. Now, I don't know, that might be hankering for the good old days, I don't know, but I will say that that's worked before. And I think if we can be thoughtful about what uses we allow, perhaps we do get prescriptive, so we don't have vape shops in Greenbrier. Maybe that's what we need to do. I mean, I realize we could get endlessly, you know, at a list that goes on and on and on in terms of what we don't like, but I think we should err on the side of allowing people to live their lives. And if they can do something, maybe 4,000 is too big, maybe we knock it down to 2,000 in RA, and 4,000 does seem pretty large.
4,000 for certain uses. Like 4,000
Yeah.
mini grocery store, 4,000 square feet,
Whatever.
better than 1,200.
That would be my view, I think.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm done.
So when I wrote up countless home occupations as a transportation plan when I was doing that, and, you know, we had guidelines and things, but, you know, a lot depends on the business, but I also had a section, you know, I reached out to the to the neighbors and got their input as well. So a lot really, when board of supervisors, just 10 years ago when I did, it's like, well, what do the residents think? Because they bought this house a lot and not expecting it to be retail or, cars coming in and out and things. And so a lot really depended on the use and the impact. And so that's the lens that I would be, kind of looking at it through, because if you bought a house, no matter where it is, and you're just like, well, you look at it and you think about the traffic flow and things. And so we know that medical and places like that, they have certain peaks, anyway, so that would be the lens that I look through, the impact and probably the use, so.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I will say, I don't know if it's possible for them to bring up the use matrix. Just give people a sense of what we're really talking about. There's not that many that are actually allowed in terms of commercial uses. For example, you can't have a private club, apparently. You can't have a small brewery, which that's unfortunate. But,
So take it out of your basement. Brian.
yeah. It's pretty limited in terms of what's allowed, and even the things that are allowed, there's asterisks, use standards apply. So
But we don't know what the use standards are at this point. Is that right?
no,
So
but we got-
that's what we're talking about, is what those use standards would be. So they proposed at this point the corner lots. I think a lot of conversation today has been around that square footage number, knocking it down.
I guess my point is that if you look at all the possible sorts of commercial uses that are listed, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that are allowed by use in residential.
In RA or any residential?
RA.
Okay. But what about the neighborhoods where we've got them designated, the entire neighborhood is RB?
The
About the
only
same.
difference
1,
is
2,
food and
3,
beverage.
4, 5, 6.
And then I guess special or general retail would be an SUP right now in RA. But other than that, food and beverage was the only difference between those. And there was the over 4,000, but that was a typo. So. And I would argue that food and beverage fits just as well in RA, and it's by SUP anyway, so. Why are we blocking it?
Well, I guess one of the questions, if you think about this notion of having commercial uses in residential zones as the lower barrier to entry, doesn't that sort of assume that the person is still living there?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I was gonna suggest that, and I know you guys hate doing this with Airbnbs, but owner occupancy maybe should be something that gets you different, like held to a different standard, right? Because you're the neighbor anyway. They're gonna come and yell at you if you're being a nuisance. And that seems different than someone saying, I'm gonna go to that neighborhood and open up a 3,000 square foot vape shop.
The other question, I guess, is also, are we talking about commercial, as sort of a mixed use kind of a thing, commercial and residential on the same site, or how are we looking at this?
Yeah, it depends on, I don't think, this is not assuming, as presented here, it's not assuming that it has to be mixed use. I've seen examples of each of these that are mixed use, but I've also seen examples of each of these that are not. But if, for example, if the standard was attached to it that it has to be owner occupied, which basically means if I start out and I grow my business at home, I also can't move out.
I would probably make it, it's by right if it's owner occupied and SUP if it's not, something like that.
Well, I don't know about that. Lee, I'm gonna ask if you or Christie have any comments on this issue.
Well, a couple things. One, corner lots are different. And they're different for a key reason, and that is they have more frontage and more access options if they want to provide parking, because you can get to the rear yard without going past the house. So there is a difference between a corner lot and a mid-block lot in most urban lots. Now, if we're talking about you know, the larger lots in, one of the portions of town with 18,000 square foot lots, you know, all bets are off. There's lots of land area, et cetera. But if we're really talking about the urban patterns of Belmont and other ones in the neighborhoods, then the corner lot is advantaged for this kind of use. And it functionally fits better, gives them more parking spaces along the street adjacent to their property and more options for getting onto the back of the lot if we wanted to provide additional parking spaces. So that's just one thing I wanted to bring up. I think the challenge of owner occupied is an enormous one. You can ask James about his success in, implementing that with the Airbnb regulations. It's just really difficult to know who's where. And I also know that many, many successful examples of these are not owner occupied. They're for lease spaces. They change hands over time. Different uses are in them. So the owner occupancy requirement raises a little bit of a red flag for me.
But on the
And
other hand,
receiving rent also helps you climb the ladder to wealth, just to be clear.
but I'm not sure why it helps, as a lower barrier to entry. I mean, if that's the rationale, then the scheme of I'm going to move and I'm going to have my house that I am now vacating turned into a store or a whatever, that doesn't strike me as being a lower barrier to entry. Now, there are plenty of reasons to throw around for why some of these things make sense. But if lower barrier to entry is one of those reasons, let's focus on what really is going to lower the barrier. And
What lowers the barrier is the rent cost. Because this space will rent for far less than any formerly commercial corridor would rent, because the land cost that underlies it is lower.
And because there would be no requirement for parking and various other things that a commercial landlord would be required.
Might be subject to.
Bring up to standard.
Yes, yes.
Just that same exact point. Like if you had food truck wanted to try opening a small business, like where in the city would you purchase the space to do that? There's only a few areas that would be extremely expensive and you'd be outbid.
That's an interesting point. What if you have a food truck and your house is in a not very good location for food, but your buddy is like, come park in my front yard and set up a couple tables. We got an owner occupancy standard that wouldn't be possible. Food trucks are a little
The
different,
owner
maybe.
occupancy that requirement also has exclusionary aspects to it too. It's, particularly in the current environment, when getting into such a place is, that's the barrier to entry. So maybe a residency requirement might be, like,
Yeah, I guess I was thinking owner of the business, but yeah.
well, a residency requirement that, if you're gonna run a business out of a house, you gotta live in that house. That's still gonna open the door for all sorts of problems, but at least it's.
So,
Well, two out of the three of these spaces could be completely commercial. The shopfront house has presumably got a resident in the main house, and the shopfront down below is commercial. But you could see the corner store being commercial unit downstairs and offices above, and the one on the left, I happen to know that particular example is 100% commercial inside that house. So the owner occupancy requirement, I don't know whether perhaps you need that in the mid block, because the mid block is a little more disruptive than being on the corner. Maybe there is a place to use something about owner occupancy. But it would be a challenge to some of the kinds of things that we've been imagining based on these pictures.
I guess to me, when I look at the corner store, if like that example is it's a store with offices above, that's why we have RX.
That is, That the RX actually allow something in the base of a mixed use what is dominantly a residential building. So it could be, if the lot were large enough, it would be larger in scale than the corner store is here. The commercial use might not be larger in scale, but the total building would be larger in scale.
So I hear you on how corner lots are, sort of special and better. But I keep thinking about, probably one of the longest standing corner stores in the city. It's not on a corner, it's a mid-block store, as they call them, on Grady, right? It's in the middle of the block. They got, 15-minute spaces for on-street parking for like just their frontage. There's like 3 of them. They do, looks like they have a driveway in the back where there's probably where the people park who work there. Never been back there, I don't know. It works fine. I'm not just wandering around their parking lot. It works fine, right? Like people are only in there for 3 minutes. So like, it's not like they're hogging the whole street's parking. They take those frontage spots. And it seems a little ridiculous to me that we would go out of our way to legalize these neighborhood markets and then leave this one non-conforming when it's just.
So would you feel that there is a difference between the streets in which we have especially designated B and C, which were the streets that work streets, as opposed to the internal streets in the neighborhood? Is there a difference there that's important? Is there a difference in the corners in that regard that's important?
I think there is a difference that mostly manifests in how probably attractive and it would be to open a business there and how successful that business would be. Christy said earlier that historically, these stores gravitated to corners. That wasn't because they were illegal everywhere else. It's because then you have 2 streets of people passing you, right? And so, I think it makes sense that they would gravitate to these streets and to corners, but that's different from, we need to make sure they're illegal everywhere else. Because the difference for impacts doesn't seem to be the same, unless it's a street, maybe with no on-site parking on that side of the street or something, or on-street parking.
Okay.
So is this what we're gonna discuss today? The only thing? If not, I think we should move on or decide what we're gonna do.
I personally am a little bit disconcerted by the fact that we are discussing something that we haven't seen. That the consultants have apparently propounded some different standards and some different documents that we have not seen, and we're getting answers that are based on rules that we have not seen. I kind of wonder how much further we can profitably go down this road today.
Without critiquing it, having read the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, agreed. We're just sort of shooting in the dark.
Yeah.
Right. Well, what about this? Well, it's on page 72. Well, I don't have page 72.
Why? James, you probably have a different perspective on that.
I guess.
There's a lot of information that you're trying to manage for us.
Yeah, and we're trying to get to an endpoint for you all, a final draft, and all the input we get here. Believe me, I'm not listening to what you're saying and waiting for them to say, gotcha, we already got to that.
Right.
I just want to, we want to get this input so that we can get something in front of you guys that you guys can work from to land at what you guys, at the end of the day, decide is an adoptable zoning ordinance. So every bit of conversation is helpful for us. But yes, we are at a stage where we're making changes to this based on the feedback we've already gotten from all of you and from the public, because we have to be at that stage. Yeah.
Would it be helpful if we kind of get a general idea of what we feel about the corner lots generally? They should be treated differently versus the mid-block as a group? Do we even have a common thing, and SUPs and how much they're used versus, and the other thing being resident occupancy instead of home ownership.
Yeah.
But the concept of having resident occupancy in RA, for example, is that?
if
Because
you
it feels
guys-
like we're all over, I don't know how you can
Like,
still
really
anything we're
vote
saying.
who's good for having what's
people?
basically listed on these the existing table that we have.
No, no, I think you're saying just like, let's see where everyone
I
sits.
think on those
and-
three issues, those are kind of the three primary issues.
The things that are on the screen, there, he wants to know how you feel about those alternatives and whether you are for corner lots. If you want an SUP for, in the middle of the block lot, if you want to do owner occupancy or no, that was what I perceived your question to be. Was that not what you
Yeah.
said? Okay.
I don't know if you guys want to do a straw vote on the three issues as Kareem's presented them, or if you want to do an around the room and just everybody comments to the extent that they're comfortable at this point,
That might be.
saying and have an
That might-
idea of where you
yeah.
stand.
Yeah.
I think the program makes sense to me. Mr. Hubab, you please start.
I haven't thought about it enough, but.
Well, he asked the
Yeah,
question.
I
Here
think,
we
I think there's something to say for resident occupancy in RA specifically. I would be for that with exceptions for specific uses like a convenience store. And I don't know what that list of uses is until we can dive into, hopefully we'll have another work session that we can dive into the uses or we can send you feedback. I don't think we should limit it just to corner lots. On that, I think I answered the SUP within first point. Okay, Mr. Payne.
I'm unsure how feasible a residency requirement would ever be able to be monitored or enforced. Again, I think all of this is so specific to the specific site, location, and business that there are clearly areas outside of corner lots that would work. There are clearly corner lots that wouldn't really be ideal, and that variable could change depending on the business, which is why, in my mind, allowing it beyond corner lots, but it is greater use of the SUP process, to me, makes sense. I mean, I trust that council, the planning commission is able to have some common sense and evaluate the specific context of that proposal coming in and being able to manage it that way. Because again, even the distinction between RA, RB, and RC, there are some areas where, I mean, that's just still gonna look extremely different, like street by street, but.
I think definitely gotta allow mid-block lots, so people who already live somewhere can do this. For SUPs, I think, I think you can do really small things, smaller scale things than 4,000 by right. But bigger things should probably be SUP. And some uses like actually are kind of special uses, right? Like food and beverage can have externalities, odor and trash. That makes sense. And I would err on the side of allowing more things by SUP that are currently not allowed, like food and beverage and RA. And then was there anything, owner occupancy? I don't hate owner occupancy in theory, but I know how hard Reed's life is chasing down all these homestay owners and trying to figure out where they live. So yeah.
I'm okay with middle of the lot or middle of the block. I'm okay with homeowner occupant. Whatever you just said, not having to have a homeowner live there. I'm also basically just looking again at the use table, unless this has changed in the new draft. In RA, I'm fine with a medical, which is what you have listed, up to 4,000. That might be too big, maybe 2,000. Office, you've got 4,000. I might be more comfortable in RA with 2,000. Personal service, I think I'd be more comfortable with 2,000 than 4,000. And then general retail, you already have listed as a special use permit required.
But there's also RB and RC.
I'm speaking to RA right this minute. Yeah. So relative to RA, which I think is what most of the frustration has been about tonight, right? Is the RA component. Okay. The pieces that are listed for RB and RC that you have on your use table, I'm basically good with those. I think that 4,000 is probably appropriate for those square footages for those areas. Yeah, I'm basically good with what you've already, again, it's fairly limited if you actually look at the use table. in terms of what people can do. It's not like, you can have a skate rink or something.
So I'm good with, I think we're too privileged on occupancy. I'm good with the corner lots. I'm a little dubious about mid lots. And I think there should be an SUP requirement for all of these iterations.
For me, I've followed with great. Please. Now, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. There was a distraction. It'll come back. I've watched with great interest the battles in other cities over special use permits for ice cream shops and coffee shops within where people live. Can take years of public process, vast amounts of money, incredible drama, relationships torn apart. From a dramatic perspective, I love it. It's delicious. I don't know that it's a good way to run policy. I'd suggest that we focus SUP process as much as possible on health and safety issues that are real, that we can defend in court, that we can point to. I appreciate aesthetics. I appreciate, some ice cream is better than others. I believe that fervently, but please let's focus on measurable outcomes. Mid-block, I see value in. I know there are no illegal mid-block businesses in Charlottesville, but if there were, and we legalize them, there would be, they would magically appear and pay taxes, which I see value in. That is what I have.
So I am generally not a fan of commercial uses, particularly in residential zones and RA in particular. The interesting problem that I see, and I commented on this at the last meeting, is that if we're talking about having a small retail store, for example, in an RB lot, and we've decided that we want to put RB lots all around the schools because we want people to live there, not because we want stores there, then maybe, and we're concerned that, kids walking, sort of the dramatic example would be the kid who walks by the vape shop and, terrible things are happening, whatever. But the point is that if the purpose of making some of these places more dense for population near a school, if that's the purpose why we're creating that as an RB lot, then why are we also increasing the amount of commercial activity that we want to allow on that lot? So there's some sort of incongruities there. The main advantage, the reason I've suggested focusing on corner lots has been that it provides a natural system of rationing. You can't have but so many of that particular lot, of that particular use, if they're going to be on corner lots. That doesn't mean that it's the most intelligent way to ration, but it is at least a legally defensible way to ration, it seems to me. If there were a legally defensible way to ration some of these uses, some other criterion other than what has been sort of suggested of, well, we've already got 2 on this block and maybe 3 is just one too many. That gets hard for me to understand how we defend that. Also struck by one of the objections that folks have made to the idea of to the zoning ordinance in general, in particular to things like RB lots, and particularly to some of these alternative forms, is the question of what do we do about front yard setbacks? What do we do about the way it presents itself on to the street? Do we specifically say, as I think I remember having seen in some draft someplace, that no, we would not allow you to have parking in your off street in the front there. I keep thinking about what's going to work economically, and my concern is that what's going to work economically in most of the neighborhoods where we're talking about is it's not going to work unless there's a significant increase in traffic. and specifically traffic coming to that store, not driving past the store on the way home to buy a thing of milk. And so I think to some extent, we have tried to find a lot of different rationales for some of these changes, and some of them end up being contradictory. And I haven't quite figured out beyond that, I mean, a sense of unease with the way that things are unfolding here. I mean, the easiest way to not have that sense of unease is to say, let's have no commercial activity in RA, and let's kind of ration it some in RB and RC. I'm not 100% there yet, but that's frankly kind of where I'm leaning.
How do you feel about the SUP question?
If there were, if we were to think about what the criteria would be for SUP, obviously a lot of times we have SUP issues that really are impossible to adjudicate without a site plan. And that was the original intent of our ordinance, was that you were supposed to have a real site plan when you had an SUP application, instead of what we often get now where the SUP application is granted subject to submitting a site plan, which is sort of backwards way to do it. But I understand the economics of why that happens, because it's so darned expensive to do it the other way. If we had some issues where the SUP process and the SUP decision was going to be made on bases that were not going to be so darned expensive to prepare, I think I would be more interested in having more SUPs. For example, I mean, if it turns out to be a valid basis for an SUP grant or denial to say, we already, we're not going to grant it because we already have 2 stores like that on the block. Hopefully that would be that'd be something where people would say, okay, we can't have 3 on the block. I see there are already 2. I'm not going to bother. As opposed to where we kind of get right now, where it just seems like everything is so discretionary that people say, maybe I got to take my chances. Maybe I got to see how that's going to work. And that's the kind of uncertainty that adds to everybody's expenses in a way that does not help governance. So it's a sort of a non-answer, but if we had a way of finding criteria for SUP grant or denial that were not so intensive on engineering and all the rest of that stuff, and therefore not so expensive, that might be a lower barrier to entry than what we're thinking now.
Would a mixed use requirement alleviate your concern about, we want more density near schools, why are we allowing commercial?
It might. I mean, I haven't thought about it,
So I am fine with the mid block, fine with the corner. I'm finer with the corner than mid block. Does it have to be a home occupied for me? I would like as much for it to be SUP as possible, because that gives us an opportunity to review it based on what's going on in the neighborhood. So I know that it's cost and more paperwork and things, bureaucracy, but this is, we're dealing with people's biggest impact and biggest financial asset, thank you, it's been still kind of jet lag, so that they have, so I think that, I want to have that review. And the buildings, I like the smaller 2,000 square foot building, but I think a 4,000 one could be done nicely, but the smaller ones, to me, that the scale is I kind of like the scale of that, so yeah, that's kind of where I'm. And so also the way I'm looking at this is that not that this is something that we want to do every few years or few months, but in my mind, that if we approve something in December and we get a few projects in and it's not going the way we want it, then we have the ability to go back and modify it and say, you know what, it's not going the way we want it. And we as council, as community, and said, no, we want to go with 4,000 square, whatever. So this is not set in stone, whatever we ultimately decide on. So, but I understand we want to try to make the best decision that we can initially. So.
I am opposed to an owner occupancy requirement. I think RA, the first word, the first letter there is R for residential. So I would look at these more as a mixed use by right. That is to say, if you're gonna put whatever you're putting on there, you've got to preserve at least one residential unit on that same piece of property, so that we're not essentially kneecapping our own housing supply, which, in case anybody hasn't noticed, is a problem. I think I'm fine with mid-lots. And I think SUPs have their place where we've got a by right situation, so long as you preserve a residential unit, and then things are more conditional if you're not, and going to a complete non-residential area. Another reason I'm against the occupancy issue is that you could easily have a situation where an owner occupant is renting the storefront to somebody, and the owner occupant then needs to depart. And to preserve the ownership of the property, they need to rent the residential unit out too. And that is designed to preserve their own, things happen to people. And that is a practical, we actually have some evidence that that is practically useful, because in the world of FHA lending, you have to own or occupy it. If you buy a condominium, they won't let you finance an FHA on a condominium with any sort of deed restriction of that occupancy, because they want the FHA homeowner, if they have to rent it, to keep the property. So I think that the VA has the same rule. So I think that sort of plays a role. So to summarize, I'm fine with mid-lots, I'm fine with corner lots, I'm fine with expanding by right, as long as you preserve the residential, a residential unit in it. Otherwise, we expand on the SUP.
Like the corner lot idea. I'm on the fence about mid-lot. However, when we're talking about SUPs and all of the intricacies of what has to happen in order for an SUP to be granted, I think we could, this word may not be the right word, but maybe there's a way that it could be streamlined for what is having to happen. Because I could see like the corner store being the little bodega and, somebody living on top, but maybe not. Or you could use the corner store like the gentleman indicated, where it would be two, the little coffee shop, and next door to it, the flower shop or whatever. But if it was just a strict 4,000, that seems like a lot to me. But where you have the corner store or your shop front, if it was 4,000, you could, divide it in half. So my little coffee shop or bakery is 2,000, and my little flower shop is 2,000. The owner occupancy could, in my mind, present a problem long-term. Initially, it may not, but long-term it could. So I think that that's something you need to consider carefully. But the most important thing is any decision that is made is not irrevocable. You can always go back. But I think when we're talking about special use permits, the way they're currently done, it takes a lot. And we are not trying to give anybody any extra work, unless you just have, these 5 individuals to deal with SUPs for these particular categories, which, probably won't happen. So streamlining your SUP process for this particular set of circumstances, I think is fair. And you need to know, you need to have a general idea of what the person wants to do. You don't want to say, oh, well, Leah, you have SUP. And then the next thing you know, Leah's done whatever, and you didn't know that that's what Leah was gonna do. So I'm thinking that there needs to be something, you know, I don't know, an executive summary or whatever. I mean, you know, maybe you're not gonna go full blown with the scale, but have an idea of what the individual wants to do before you say yes. You just can't say yes and not no.
So I think these businesses or these opportunities within the RA, RB, and RC districts are incredibly important as a first step to, you know, a future of Charlottesville that is more walkable. As automobile ownership becomes less and less affordable, I think we do need to have some first baby steps so that we can get to a denser city. I mean, I think within the RA, we definitely need to cut the size down of these uses. 4,000 is kind of big for most of these uses. I don't think we need to have an owner occupant, but I do think we need to have a resident someone living on the property. I would say at least 50% of the square footage of the project should be residential. So that way, at least, you know, if it's a nuisance, there's someone living on the site that's experiencing the nuisance. The SUP, generally, as we have it listed in the use matrix that you've given to us already, I think makes sense. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Is that a help?
Absolutely. We want to close that item.
Very much.
So there was not a whole lot of questions or comments on the first part of the presentation. No, we kind of went, yes. Sir.
I do have a question on that. Where did the 35 feet come from? Was there the reason I'm asking is it eliminates a house form that's kind of a traditional house form with 2 rooms on the side of a center hall. And I guess that's fine if there's a good reason for the 35 feet because it's
Christy,
just the right massing standard or.
That's a question for you, the 35 feet on the building width, what we're talking about.
Yeah, we found in most communities that is a fairly typical maximum width of a lot of sort of in-town houses, even up to a more colonial style house. And then once you get into a bit more suburban of a pattern, the houses tend to get wider. So we found it as a fairly good maximum building width. But it's one of those dials that, you know, some communities will want to turn down to more like 30 if they're more bungalow style houses. And some communities want to turn up to maybe like a 40 or 45 if they do see more of those either 4 square or colonial style houses.
It also gives access to the backyard on one side. If you constructed it that way, you could get a driveway past it to a rear garage. Just enhances the options for getting to other portions of the land.
Wasn't a big deal. I was curious. Thank you.
I do feel like we have a lot of houses, a lot of houses that are significantly wider than 35 feet. Like, I mean, I haven't tried to figure out what side is the front to measure this, but if you guys are capable of that, it'd be interesting to see what like the median would be. But I would imagine that 35 feet is not like the median house is wider than 35 feet.
I mean, what this would do is it would start forcing smaller typologies within our city. So
Yeah, I mean,
it's kind of I'm not sure what is the right answer for that.
Skyrocket all the houses that are bigger, all right.
Yeah, or, I mean, go deep.
I mean, it's, yeah, you're forcing houses to go deep. I generally, I think like, you know, I think we're doing a lot to make it possible to have smaller and more affordable typologies. And I feel a little weird about forcing people into smaller typologies and saying, no, you can't have that, you know, sprawling ranch house, but it's just me.
Everything near the high school would be.
Yeah, I mean, and even, you know, in Rose Hill and GPA, it's not just Greenbrier and
Any other issues about RA, RB, and RC that we want to discuss tonight?
So I just, from some of the conversations that I've heard in earlier meetings, are we still basically committed to that zoning map at this point in terms of where these places are? I know, Mr. Mayor, you've, I think, a few times have been concerned with like the how widespread these areas are. I mean, is that something that the ship kind of sailed with the future land use map?
Better not have, because we were promised it hadn't.
So I guess I'm trying to get at the frustration that you just evinced. I mean, what is it?
Well, the frustration was that when we tried to talk about it 2 years ago, everybody said, oh, we'll fix it later.
So I guess that's my mind is, if we're talking about RB, RA, RB, RC, maybe we
Yeah.
have that conversation.
This is a perfect time to have that conversation.
so I think one thing that is making it difficult to have that conversation, I think, is this idea, maybe insistence from staff that we can only turn that dial one way, that we're only allowed to go down. Because, you know, I think there are places where people have made pretty convincing arguments, or even I have said, well, maybe it doesn't make quite so much sense here, but maybe it makes some sense over there as you do that finer scaled review. But if you can only turn the ratchet one way, it seems like any map changes are just kind of, you know, all we're doing is eviscerating the middle intensity and removing all those opportunities for those sort of denser and more affordable and family-sized housing forms that you're not going to get in those mid-rise corridors.
I would say it's the basis of our recommendation that of turning down from, and this is to be clear from the land use map alone, right? Turning down from the land use map, that's something you can do without making any changes to the land use map, right? If we turn up from the land use map, then we are then we have to amend the comprehensive plan. And
I don't think anyone's suggesting that at this point.
well,
I think that's what we said we were gonna do in 2021.
And I admit, I said that we could amend the land use map, but as we have moved forward and in the conversations I've had, particularly with legal counsel, that does introduce a wider range of complication into our adoption process, right? Because we would have to simultaneously amend the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance. It's not that it's not doable, but I'm saying that opens up the door for a lot of possibilities of things to go wrong, to be challenged, to be whatever. Right, it complicates your process much more.
So the notion of dialing some things up, is that like in the conversations that we've had like last week when?
There were things that we talked about dialing up that are within what is allowed under the land use map. That where the zoning started lower, but you could go higher in the zoning and still be within what's in the land use map. Don't have a concern there. It's where we're dialing up past what was contemplated on the adopted comprehensive plan.
And how many, you probably don't know this off the top of your head, maybe it's a long list of places that's being proposed.
It's not a long list now.
33,
I mean,
33 places.
that's my recollection.
it's things like, some of them are things like, you know, people are saying, well, you put it RB on Plymouth Road because it's next to Greenleaf Park. But, you know, the entrance to Greenleaf Park is over there a block away. Why don't you move some of it over there? Which I think makes sense. It doesn't like net reduce opportunities for it on the whole. I mean, I think there's reasons to keep it there as well instead, but so I could go either way, but you know, we're saying we don't have that option of saying, let's move it from here to there. We can only say, let's remove it from here.
So you're saying that if we do indeed ratchet up in the sense that we're violating the form, so we have to make those changes. You're saying that, I mean, we can't contemplate a process where we say, okay, we intend to make an adjustment to this ordinance and to this comprehensive plan specifically for this purpose and we're doing it in one shot. And here are the changes that we've decided on, and we're gonna make those changes all at once.
I'm not saying that you can't, I'm saying it introduces greater complication into your adoption process.
And then on the other side of that, if we're dealing with a limited number of properties, and I just don't want to be too clever by half, but okay, well, we know what they are. And if you show up with an SUP or you want to rezone that particular parcel, there's going to be an enormous amount of sympathy for doing that.
What is the other alternative? Is there an alternative to go back after a month and say, change those?
Yeah, I mean, you can go back at a time and then you can sequence a comprehensive plan amendment and a zoning amendment. Or do them simultaneously, but focused on a particular set of parcels. There's a lot of options. I
Wonder, Mr. Stroman, do you have any insight you could offer here, what might make sense?
I think that the simultaneous comp plan zoning ordinance amendment as a solution is a, in my experience, at least a heavy lift. And it also is really not how land use law in Virginia is designed. The whole idea is that you could comp plan and then you amend your zoning ordinance in contemplation of the comp plans. Really, there's the idea of a sequential process as opposed to a simultaneous process. And the simultaneous process, I think, is A, a heavy lift, and B, really not what Virginia law contemplates. And so the main law that I'm concerned about in this context and in many contexts is the law of unintended consequences. And I think that the risk of that tends to go up. I hope I at least partially.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's just a mistake.
No, it stays where it is.
We write it down.
Any additional discussion of RA, RB, and RC? We could discuss map changes at this time, if you wish.
I guess as someone who was not part of the process 2 years ago or whatever this, 2 years ago? Is that right?
Roy said it was two.
Yeah,
2021.
6.5 years ago, 2 years ago.
Well, when you adopted the future land use map, wasn't it 6 years ago?
Right, well, it started then, right?
September of 2021.
We started in 17 and we finished in 2021.
So, I mean, the sorry, the future land use map identified these areas as medium intensity residential, right? And then the further blending of that, or feathering, or whatever you want to call it, happened as part of the
development of the zoning map. So
As
we
part of the
had a future land use map that identified these areas of medium intensity and placed them at an up to 12 unit number. And then as we
based off the streets that work plan.
No, that was, we then, as we were developing the zoning map, we came back to then develop 2 zoning districts to implement the medium intensity. One of those of the RB up to 6 units, and then the RC of up to 8 units.
With the bonus intensity.
Well, the bonus we didn't propose, that didn't come until later. So the bonus didn't come until September 23rd of 2022. In a joint meeting.
Sure.
with
Right.
Planning Commission and Council. The initial proposal was strictly 6 and 8. And in our analysis of 6 and 8 compared to 12, we felt we arrived at a place where we were comfortable with the medium intensity as it was presented.
With 6 to 8.
And
No, 6 and 8.
6 in the RB and 8 in the RC.
Right.
And that in particular, if you look at the mapping logic document, the RC was placed at the intersection of more significant roads according to streets that work. The RB was the remainder of the medium intensity as identified on the land use map.
Okay.
And Lloyd, correct me if my memory is wrong, but I think throughout our council discussion, this is just accurate, and it's what the conversation was, that our conversation revolved around the future land use map being a maximum longer term build out the zoning did not need to immediately match the maximum build out on the future land use map. And the goal was after passing it, that there would be a lot by lot analysis looking at where it was more appropriate on a shorter term time horizon in terms of like where medium and high intensity residential went. So that was our council conversation. I don't know if planning commission, had a different expectation, understanding when you passed it on your end, but.
You have now spent more time talking about the future land use map than council did 2 years ago. I mean, we really didn't talk about it at all. I tried to get council to say, we shouldn't adopt this plan and change the comprehensive plan as to these parcels without discussing them parcel by parcel, or at least block by block. And I couldn't even get a second for that. So we have not thought about it. We were basically told we got to get this done before the end of the year. And we got it done, finally the comp plan done in December, before 2 councilors went off. And we never spent any time talking about the future land use map in detail. In gross, yes, we talked about it, but not in detail as to any particular lot.
So is what Michael just said unable, where is it what Michael just said? I mean, was it never actually nailed down? Was it just discussions, Michael? Was it understanding? I mean.
Maybe different recollection. I wasn't there, so.
I mean, maybe
Neither
it's.
was I, that's why I'm asking him. It makes perfect sense what he just
I
said.
don't want to get down too much this rabbit hole because I'm not sure how germane it will be to decisions and conversations we have tonight. My recollection is we did have some meaningful conversation around it
Okay.
along with 221s. I think it is fair that it was not a very detailed,
Okay.
very thorough process.
Okay,
And we did not have any discussion of a lot by lot analysis, and at least my understanding of that process, what the expectation was. A lot by lot analysis would happen once you move to the actual zoning rewrite.
okay,
And that the future land use map was a product primarily of the planning commission's work over multiple years and set a very broad, longer term goal. That
okay.
So
I'll agree with that.
So you could still have a lot by lot conversation based on the information that is being proposed,
Which is where we are now, right?
right? Yes, that's where we are, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So I think part of the problem is that, well, so it's a longer term version just by definition, since none of this is gonna happen overnight, right? But like, I think when we had talked about a lot by lot tweaking of it back then, we were thinking of it, and we were in those sessions as sort of tweaks around the margin, of saying like, well, we're gonna continue looking at this as we have been, and as, I mean, maybe you guys hadn't thought about it or talked about it as much, but certainly we were. And there will be some tweaks to be made. And now we're hearing that if we're to do such a lot by lot analysis, which I think generally that's a good idea, that we can only make changes in the direction of prohibiting this sort of housing in more places. That we can't, legally speaking, at least, maybe we could do it down the line next year or years after. But right now, all we can do is turn that dial down.
Well, let me ask this. So
So is the 6 to 8 dialing down?
Yeah, I mean, I would say 6 to 8 was dialing down from the 12, and that's good. I think that made sense. But what they're saying is we can only remove RB and RC. We can only move it to RA or.
Which also sounds consistent with at least council's interpretation of the land use map as it was just presented. You just said that the land use map was viewed as an upper bound of where we are.
And again, I'm not even trying to opine on what would be the right policy, but the factual record is that was our conversation.
But that's all I'm trying to get at is the conversation to get a framework.
And so if that's
Brian
the
and I
case,
were not here 2 years ago.
so if that's the case, the medium intensity residential, what was the maximum? 8? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that
It
what
was 12.
Was 12.
It was 12.
And you went to 8 for this category and 6 for the other
It
category.
sounds like they went to 8 and 6 based off their professional judgment of what they thought would fit in these.
Correct.
Because staff did do a lot by lot general analysis?
We did a review of the map, our consultants did a review of the map.
Okay, all right.
So so I understand, Mr. Stolzenberg, your concern of sort of puts and takes as we shift things around the board here. You know, what it sounds, I think what you're worried about is we're basically sort of locked into what the comp plan sort of anticipated, and I think we are, based off what our attorney's telling us.
Yeah.
So is the concern that we're just giving up so much that it's deeply concerning, or can we still get like 90% of where we want to be with what we got?
Yeah, I think
Because
that's
if
an
we
open
get to-
question.
If we can get 90% of what we want, where we are, then I think we have to move forward.
I think that's fair. Yeah, and I think, you know, if we're talking about tweaks around the margin, you know, I suggested the other day to take those 10 at the very top of the Lexington loop off of there. Things like that, I think are reasonable. If we're gonna be removing, you know, blocks and blocks of RB and RC, you're effectively undermining the entire purpose.
And I'm not suggesting that, because it sounds to me like RA, RB, and RC were anticipated with the medium intensity residential. So, and the feathering or whatever that was done around the, you described earlier, James. I guess my question to the mayor is, you know, what is a process, what is a way for us to get to what might be appropriate as a max size for RC and RB? Is your concern that we'd have to go to every particular area to decide that? Or?
No, I mean, obviously, when we draft an ordinance, the ordinance has to be of general applicability. What I said at the last meeting was that to a certain extent, the areas that I think should properly be RB will depend on how we end up defining RB. And until we've defined RB, I can't tell, for example, judging by the emails of the last couple of days, I can't tell the people on Plymouth and Harrow what RB is going to mean for them when we've designated them as RB. And the reason we've designated them as RB is because they're right next to the property for Walker. And then the question is, well, why are we bothering with commercial applications in RB for them? And maybe the answer is, let's have a category of residential, if you want to have somewhere between RA and RB, I don't know, that basically says, we're not going to have commercial here.
So is your main concern the commercial piece or the size, the density that's allowed for both?
Both, but.
Because the density, I mean, in what's in the draft anyway, we don't know what's in the draft. I mean,
And to add on to that, Lloyd.
So I can understand. what
well, in
you're
other words, what I'm having a hard time understanding when you're saying I can't define what RB is until I know where it's going to be, until I know what it is. I mean, what we're saying it is right here, right now. I mean, the three.
Well, and part of when I was asked, I said, you know, I would want to redefine what is permissible in RA, RB, RC in ways that will enable us to get to what I think is a good land use. And that if we end up doing one thing over here and one thing over here and never put the two of them together, we're not going to get a good intelligent result. And so when I'm looking at the area around, and I'll broaden it a little bit to Rugby Avenue and so on, which we've now this draft has basically all of Rugby Avenue as RB, all of Grove Road as RB, and I'm thinking for residential purposes that might make some sense. But to say every one of those lots could now be a store of some sort or a commercial application of some sort doesn't make any sense. And it gets in the way of our goal of trying to increase housing. And so one of the questions that I asked last time and have been trying to work on in the intervening week plus is trying to figure out what we what we really think we're gonna do with commercial uses in residential zones. A, how badly do we want them? B, how frequently do we want them? How big do we want them? And, you know, if we say we're going to allow certain things in those zones because that's the way we've defined RB, but the real characteristic of RB is greater housing density, not greater commercial application, then we're trying to do one thing and creating unintended consequences on the other side.
Although I would add, I mean, I think it's a very different calculus in terms of what commercial use means if it's when it's SUP versus by right. I think that's just a very different world, because I think in part of it is not just housing for housing's sake, but that you're at least there's some legal mechanism to create neighborhoods that have a sense of place where you could walk to a store, a coffee shop, if that's something people want. And there's certainly areas in the city where people want that, but it's just 100% illegal with no mechanism to get there right now. As well as kind of these broader goals around, is there a way that even on a small scale, you reduce the need to drive everywhere for every single purchase? That kind of thing, I think, is in line with some of the broader goals. Although I do hear your point, especially if you're talking about by right uses, because there are RB and RC areas where if you walk that area, your perception would be hard to figure out what distinguishes this from some areas that are RA. A question to kind of what you had raised is, one, is your primary concern with RB and RC down to the height of buildings, the density in terms of number of units, the overall building footprint? What is it that on that issue?
We've talked about RA and RB early on, at least, as being based on house size buildings. It's interesting that in, Rory, the stuff that you were giving us over the last little bit, your idea of house size seems to be looking at footprint, where a 3,000 square foot footprint, for example, whereas it's a 3,000 square foot entire house that we're talking about as house size. And what I was looking at and thinking about was, supposing you had a limit of gross, I don't remember what the official term is, gross square footage or something, of say 4,500 square feet for the entire building, not just footprint. And then we can start talking about what a house-sized building looks like and what a neighborhood that is built around house-sized buildings feels like. And when you talk to neighbors who are looking at this and they're thinking, okay, I'm looking at all of these different criteria, and I'm not going to try to get into the details there, but it looks like we've got, you know, so many thousand square feet of footprint and how many stories that's going to be. And now all of a sudden we're looking at some of the examples we were being shown earlier of 8,000 and 9,000 square foot gross square footage buildings do not look like houses. And if we're going to be true to what we told people 2 years ago, and maybe we shouldn't bother. I personally think we should, in part because I invested a lot of my time trying to convince people that this was really going to be okay, people. It's really going to be okay because they promised us house-sized buildings. That house-sized buildings, that doesn't mean 8,000 and 9,000 square foot buildings. And so I'm looking at in part what we told the people when we passed this 2 years ago. I'm looking at in part at how people, I think, have a reasonable expectation of how fast, how their neighborhood would change and in what ways. I'm not opposed to all change, certainly. And I'm in favor of a number of definitions of building size and building use that would enable considerably greater density of population, particularly. I'm thinking, for example, I have a 4,500 square foot cap on a building. You could easily have 4 townhouses in there, 2 over 2, and my son lives in a place kind of like that in Somerville, Massachusetts, and it works. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, he's on a 2 over 2 over 2. But the point being that I think the number, if we're looking at trying to maximize the number of units of housing created, there are ways to do that that don't end up with, 9,000 square foot buildings.
Which would be in terms of your, do you have a proposal in terms of what would be modified within RB or RC?
Well, I'm not thinking about RC, because RC, we were not told was going, and I think they said for RC, we're talking about mansion-sized buildings, as I recall the phrase. And I don't know what that means exactly, but it clearly is more than a house size. I'm thinking for RA, and I've said, and this of course goes back to what I said 2 years ago, that I thought what we ought to be doing is not designating particular areas for medium intensity residential, acknowledge that the category exists, figure out place by place, block by block, whether this is appropriate or not. In the context of this particular discussion, we're talking about every single lot allowing 3 units, effectively tripling the carrying capacity. I recognize it wouldn't all get built out, but that's fine. And recognizing that that is already a very major change in the way we're going to be building out our community. And that if we do that and we say everything is RA with 3 units, and let's designate some particular areas. I suggested earlier a corner, just because it has a self-rationing aspect to it, that we could allow greater density. That's fine. Or maybe we have some areas, and maybe the RC areas are the places where we do this, where we would still have some size limitations and that sort of thing. But I've not thought about the details of what that would look like, in part because I don't know whether I've got even a second for the vote on council, much less 3. So anyway, my overall thought, this is basically what I've said, that if we just say, let's recognize that the change we're making of tripling the carrying capacity of the residential neighborhoods is already a big change. Let's see where that gets us. Let's look at things 5 years down the line. Oh, and also, and still adding some higher density on corners and so on. And then see where that gets us 5 years down the line, and who knows?
Is there a
Would your, sorry, Michael.
You're good.
I'm sorry. Would your proposal then would allow for the density question, but also walkability, because within that area, if someone wanted to do a corner store or bodega or whatever, they could do it on a corner lot. You have more people could walk to the coffee shop, or people could walk to whatever. What you just said allows that to happen. Am I?
Yeah, and it's not a fully thought out.
I didn't say it was fully thought out, but in
yes,
general,
that's
the
the
overarching
direction.
thing,
I guess
yes.
my question.
There you
is-
go. I got you.
I guess my question is, if the email that Mr. Stolzenberg sent out the other day about the missing middle, and Norfolk 6-pack, these other types of housing that are specifically designed for, families. I'll just reference, I'm assuming you saw the email and people had a chance to read it. I mean, basically, it's a style of housing that is set up to allow families to live there, and the price point is such that they can afford it. What Rory would say is that your proposal is going to limit, help me here if I'm missing, going to limit the amount of that kind of housing in our area. If that's, I don't know for sure if that's true or not. I mean, his email was persuasive, but I'm not an expert. What I will say is that if, when we get all said and done with all of this, if we're not thinking about that kind of housing, the missing middle type housing, whether it's the 6-pack or the 8-pack or whatever, then I think we're not really realizing the potential, or really what we were hoping, what many people were hoping would come out of this process. I guess your point would be that you could still get most of that in the NX and the CX and the RX and places like that.
My thought is that if we end up with 3 units on lots, we're gonna have missing middle.
So that's the Minneapolis model, right? I think James mentioned it in his memo, is saying we'll allow 3, which is a 1 unit increase over the current, because you can have an ADU, no owner occupancy requirement anymore. But we will force you to do it within the size of a pretty small house. And so you can either have a house, or you can have
your definition of pretty small,
or even in an average size house, maybe, right? But certainly not, one that would have ample. If you split it into 3, you can have 3 tiny units, or you can have a house, but you can't have 3 ample size units that families can fit in. And so in the end, Minneapolis passed this, and they've gotten practically none of them, right? On the order of a few dozen across the city, that's 12 times their size. And that's because it's just not very attractive. What we need is places for families to live, right? And part of the way you do that is by providing the floor area, the square footage for them to actually live in. And you're not going to get that in the mid-rise zones for all the reasons I laid out. And it's difficult to do at best in the RA zone, right? I think to the extent that you'll see that at all, it will be just a separate house on a lot split situation, maybe a row of 3 townhouses, but something like that 6-plex, where you have essentially what you need is a family size unit times 2 is your footprint, times the number of floors you get is the number of units. And you can do it on, this lot, right? This is a 42,000 square foot building, right? You cannot do that. We don't want that. That's not house size. But you can do this, if you limit the footprint, you can get, you're right. It would be a mansion, which I think we have talked about allowing in RC, but it fits on the lot very reasonably with lots of extra yard. It's not larger than the largest houses largest mansions we have in the city. And you could comfortably fit 8 families there who could share the space and share the costs of that land and create an accessible environment for that type of living. Or you make it illegal.
I guess the other question I had was, isn't the notion, James, of this form-based, that's what we're working with, form-based code, right? So if I'm looking here in the draft to the draft,
Yeah.
For RC, and I'm looking at, the build to areas and the percentages, but part of this too is the height, the massing, the ground story, the transparency, the entrances, the walls and fences, all of those various components are what's supposed to make it not perhaps house size, but house scale.
House scale and compatibility is what the target is.
Right.
Right, and I guess I would say is the focus has been on what is the presentation from the street.
Yes.
That's why we've focused so much on the width of those houses and how they so that you're maintaining an overall streetscape that feels consistent, that feels like, I don't know, consistency within the place.
Yeah.
That's been the target. That's also speaks to why there's the entrance requirements, the transparency requirements, so that the form there's on Park Street, there's townhouses, right? And they fit in with that environment largely. They fit in with that environment. My biggest complaint, if I will, about that project is it has no front on the street, and that's what makes it really kind of disruptive to that overall sense of the consistency within the place.
Yeah, I guess for me, I feel like that, you know, this is new to us, this type of form-based code. But I think the professionals here that are laying this out have done this in other places. Seems to me that we could build RC type the way they have here laid out. And it would look fine. The business about the commercial, I understand that, but I think between you know, the SUP process and I also just that's the problem with this whole process, right? When you do the future land use map, people think, well, this is like the plan to build everything out. Well, it's not, it's the sort of envelope. But we can't really predict what the future will do in terms of like, you know, the financial returns for people to make financially rational decisions. But I think it's unlikely that Rugby's going to end up having, can I guarantee that? No, I can't, but the notion that would just be one stream of coffee shops and vape shops and everything just seems unrealistic to me. And if we come out of this process and we don't get the kind of housing that's going to help everyone in the community, we spend a lot of time talking about 60% and under AMI. We're spending a lot of money on that. It's very important. But if we come out of this, and I'm not the expert on it, but what I will say is if we come out of this process and we can't feel confident that we're going to get the missing middle type products that we need, then I think this will be a failure. And I'm not convinced that just because you can, you know, increase by 50%, I guess, the amount of lots on a house in units on a house in RA, but that's really going to do it for you.
And I mean, we talked about this a little bit the last work session I was at. I feel like, do you not feel, Lloyd, one way to kind of square the circle in terms of the concerns is one with commercial uses, that SUP piece, and then two with the concern about basically, even if it's unlikely, theoretically, it would be possible, like every house on one block could all be converted to follow. And I did read your memo, and I know we aren't in a completely analogous situation, so maybe it's not feasible, but Arlington's model in terms of looking at metering the annual permits as a way, because the other thing about corner lots to me is it just seems very arbitrary, and I don't see the coherent logic for why like only corner lots would be the ideal mechanism in terms of metering the rate of change each year.
It's a good starting point. It's a place that you've got better, more street access, as was noted in the earlier comments. They're often larger lots. There are a lot of more things you can do with having two sides available to the streets.
Well, it
How
seems to me
many
we
of those
can't.
would end up being any, I mean, how many people are gonna change the corner lots? We already have a very limited amount. And I feel like it also privileges people that already have them to the detriment of, you know, everybody else who's missing out.
Do you feel that?
But does this whole the purpose of this for me with this, the whole density question is having more livable, affordable space. So that if any of us sold our homes today, we could still buy something in the city. And now everyone seems to be focused on the retail aspect of this. The retail aspect is not going to bring people in any of these districts, whether it's A, B, or C. So if you are saying that B is where we can get the density for the people to live, and you're not living in a 900 square foot home, you're living in a 15 square foot home, whether it's a townhouse or whether it's, you know, two single family homes on, you know, two lots, you know, whereas before you just had one house on two lots. that should be the focus within your little map over there that you had. And then, to me, everything else falls in line. If someone wants a coffee shop, a flower shop, a bodega or whatever, your special use permits then come into play. But if we focus in on the outer rim, i.e. the commercial part, you still aren't gonna get any people. And don't you want, I mean, don't you want people? I mean, was that not the first concern, that you wanted people to live? You've committed money on the city side over a period of years to help people within a certain income bracket. But there is a certain income bracket that's not in Charlottesville. And everyone keeps saying, we want them here. We don't want them in Waynesboro. We don't want them in Culpeper or wherever it is you think they're gonna come from to come here. So should we not be focused on A, B, or C, whichever one you pick, doesn't matter, to make sure that the people are there? And then you decide through your special use permits or whatever you want to come up with, oh, well, you know what? We've got X amount of people and so would like to have this. Well, is this allowable? Well, yes. Well, is there a space for it to be allowable? Well, yes. Well, should we approve it? Well, possibly.
And I would say what you just described, I think is what they've laid out.
And I just, if it was feasible, I still, in my mind, I can see how the Arlington model squares the circle a little bit in terms of meeting some of the concerns
I would support that.
that you have raised while still not being.
Just for clarity, what you're referring to is the permit caps,
Correct.
annual permit cap.
Correct.
Yeah, so I mean,
Commercial.
I think a lot of
People-
it,
that would You're
give
talking about,
people-
Are we talking about it for housing? or
Why don't you
commercial?
specify which,
Residential.
residential, right?
it's,
I think that would give
Based on demand
people,
analysis.
people, including me, are not, calculators. We're approaching this thing understandably with a level of emotion because it's our home and there's nothing wrong with that. And I feel like even if it's arbitrary to some degree, if people felt like there was an upper max, we could adjust, but if they felt like there was an upper max, particularly for this problematic area of the MIR, that would go a long way towards helping people gauge what this is going to look like. Another council could come on board and say, no, we don't, this is far too much. We want to cut it all the way in half, and that would be their decision. One question, I'm interested in what, Mr. Wade, how are you feeling about this missing middle piece and the MIR and really it's the RB and RC that we're.
Yeah, I talked with Lord about this a couple of days ago, and I was like, Lord, we're gonna go through all of this. We need to make sure whatever we do, we're gonna get what we want. Basically, what Leah is saying, and we really don't know because of the dynamics of the economy and things are so expensive and but I want to just make the decision. I told Lord, I said, right now I'm in the information gathering stage, but I think that this is heading in the right direction. I said, I know that we have to do something. Because if we continue what we're doing now, then in 10 to 15 years, Charlottesville, I tell people that I moved into my house on St. Charles Avenue in 1999. It's the most probably middle income neighborhood that you can get. It's nothing fancy about our block for $140,000, I think. And my wife and I both were government workers, and it was a struggle for us then to purchase it. And I don't know what it's, certain assessment now, but that doesn't mean anything. But we couldn't live here now. And I'm thinking about people like ourselves. That's why we don't have a community of middle-class community of color in the city of Charlottesville. We have great jobs at maybe university, making even $120,000 a year, and it would be difficult for you to purchase property here. So I want to do something to get the results that I think that we want, that the public demands that we want. And zoning is gonna do part of it. We're putting money towards, Piedmont, PHA and other things, that's gonna be part of it as well. So this is gonna have to be a lot of things, and I'm really want to be able to say, to be able to pivot if things, all of this conversation, when we implement it, is not working for us to be able to change, because it's just not working. So right now, Bill, I'm like James and Missy down. I'm just kind of taking it all in and, kind of figuring out, when it comes to us, the five of us, I guess, in the fall, what.
Yeah, and so in additional topic, because I think you raised this, Lloyd, how much of your concern in RB and RC as well is coming down to this question of subdivisions in, is that an area where it would be useful for us to have some additional conversation in terms of what is actually allowed, like what is unlikely to happen, but still technically possible? Because I'll admit, that still confuses me some. To be
Well,
honest.
I'll say that the question of subdividing and zoning lots, I think was the phrase that we suddenly came up with, which I continue to think are going to be an ineffective tool to try to get around Virginia land use law, but that's a different problem, or at least not land use law, real estate law. The concern that I have about subdivisions and all that sort of thing is that I'm not sure that I understand what it is supposed to accomplish. And therefore, I don't know whether I would recognize it when it happened. Is the idea,
is this the question about sublots?
well, Michael, is that subdivisions, but sublots are also, one of the problems is a good part of Charlottesville is still governed by restrictive covenants that prohibit subdivisions.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the places where we would love to be able to take a 10,000 square foot lot in Greenbrier and subdivide it will not be subdividable.
And sublots doesn't change that, because sublot is a subdivision.
Okay,
It is very much a subdivision under Virginia law. There's no way around that. So on those lots, they would also not be able to use the sublot.
so I've asked people a couple times what the sublot discussion adds.
What it does is recognizing that on a lot, under these allowances, one could put 3 cottage style units and rent them out. What we want to do is create an opportunity for those to be an ownership option, because we're trying to one of our efforts here is to create more of those middle income ownership opportunities. Townhouses is the main play there. But if we can create this opportunity for ownable cottages in that environment, that's what we're aiming for.
Is the idea that then those wouldn't have to have road frontage?
Right, that's the idea. They have to achieve fire access, and but they can do so in other ways.
And I know this has already been discussed, but it's still an area. Could you walk through for me, like, let's just take, for example, a feedback we get a lot. Someone is living in RB or RC and they look at that designation and they have a concern that all of a sudden this isn't just RB, RC, this is now the lot is divided into 3 and you've tripled what RB looked like on paper. What limitations or is preventing that, or what does that look like in practice under the current draft? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense. I don't know if Lee, do you want to tackle that one, or do you want me to tackle that one?
Sure, as long as you tell me you can hear me. We don't have the phone anymore, so great. It was the intent when we set a citywide across all residential districts minimum lot size. It was our intent to get more subdivision as an equity tool in areas that already had large lots. As Mr. Snook pointed out, it won't be possible on every lot due to legal restrictions that are already in place on those lots. But there will be many places where you will be able to create a new 6,000 square foot, a pair of new 6,000 square foot lots out of, for example, a 12,000 square foot lot that exists there today. So the first step is subdivision, and then there's the allocation of rights to the new lots. So if the allocation was 3 new units, plus you can keep the existing units, so you've got 4 on one lot, and then you could do 3 new units on the new lot. So you could be at 7 units across those 2 lots, which today are fundamentally one house. And it totally intentional, and I believe successfully discussed at the time in just the way I've put it to you today.
You want to also mention, so you just described the RA, but
Yes,
I think specifically about the RB and the RC.
simply the count goes up per lot is all. But the lot size is the same.
No, in the RB, the lot size, the subdivision lot.
Is
size.
25.
Yeah, that's brought down to create, yes, that was brought down to create more townhouses and other kinds of models that would be for sale models.
So I guess to back up a little bit, to kind of, the point some folks were making earlier is like, if we look at what the broad goals are, right? I think the goal is to change that trajectory we're on and to have a place for more people to live and not be pushed out of the city. And, we've set out this broad, plan for it in the comprehensive plan that we adopted that said, we're going to do it with this, slightly denser housing forms to medium intensity housing forms, plus all the mid-rise stuff on corridors. And I think, one question for everybody is like, do we fundamentally believe that that's okay? Or is it bad to have any building be, larger than 3,000 square feet? And so if you're going to put 6 units in it, they can only be studios because otherwise they would look too large and be, an aesthetic problem. And then another, I think, is really
Just to be
like.
clear, I have not suggested 3,000 square feet.
Sure, no, sure.
4,500.
Okay, so I think the other question is, do we feel that this draft is getting us to that vision that we thought we were putting out there, right? And that's where I think guardrails come in. So technically speaking, under this draft, you could build this building probably at 3 stories after we got rid of the 4th. And it would be an extremely large building, right? Because of the limitations of setbacks. That's something many people have pointed out. It does seem problematic. It would be a little bit ridiculous to have that as an 8-unit building, but it's technically possible. Can we add some guardrails to stop that? People say, oh, well, technically every lot could be redeveloped overnight. It's unlikely to happen. They're not all going to go for sale next year. Then they're not all going to be picked up for development. One way we can put a guardrail on that is by putting on a cap.
Sorry?
One way we put on a cap, like Alexandria.
Permit caps.
Arlington, sorry, yes.
It doesn't matter, it's an A in Northern
What's the
Virginia.
difference? They're probably allowed to do it too, actually. But are there other, are we getting to the point where we think that the draft is delivering on the promise we made? Do we feel like the promise was bad and it needs to be changed and we need to go back on it? And those are the 2 questions to me. Are we still all together on that high level vision? And if so, like, do we think there are fundamental flaws with this zoning ordinance that needs to be fixed to get us there?
Should we limit that conversation to RA, RB, RC?
Specifically in those, yeah.
Does someone want to answer that question?
Well, I'll just say that I remain committed to the goal of the missing middle. one of the concerns that I've had about all of this discussion is that it is not clear whether any suggestions will get us where we want to get to. The analysis, rate of expected change analysis suggests that there are going to be a couple hundred units a year, maybe, which, you know, that's better than nothing, but let's not get overly either excited or traumatized by the idea. And so if we assume, sort of where I come from, if we start from the assumption that there is no course of action where we can say with some certainty, yes, that's going to get there, then one of the things I want to do is to minimize the political upset that is going to result from enacting a set of regulations that won't work. And so, as I've said in my original discussion of the double density bonus, for example, some of the same issues apply in a somewhat more subtle fashion in some of this. You know, when people have started to fuss at me about, you know, the difference between 3 stories and 32 feet and 35 feet and all that. Unless it's a critical path variable, that's an issue that doesn't matter in the long run. It may matter in a couple of instances, but for the most part, it's not the sort of thing that's going to turn any of us upside down. And so I want us to be focusing on things that are likely to have some real impact if we can. And to avoid the things that are simply political hot potatoes that aren't really going to solve the problem anyway. And I'm trying to figure out whether the RBRC discussions or what parts of the RBRC discussions are political hot potatoes versus what parts of them are substantive. And when I see discussions about commercial activity, and we're now all of a sudden, we're not just talking about housing, but we're talking about lowering barriers to entry for budding entrepreneurs, I get concerned that we may not accomplish either if we've diluted both. And I'm just sort of trying to process a lot of this stuff. But my overall concern with RB and RC, particularly blocks of RB and RC that are now presently RA, is on the one hand, it's highly unlikely that any of it's going to get built anytime soon. But on the other hand, if it is, odds are people aren't going to like it. And if it ever got built out the way we were rezoning it, they wouldn't like it. And I wonder if there is a way that we can eliminate or mitigate the likelihood of a result that we know we're not going to like.
And I'll just share my perspective, again, just limited to RABC. I think it would be a big policy mistake to completely throw out RB and RC. I think it is accomplishing a pure policy goal that is not just a political hot potato. I mean, if you just looked at the strict definition of missing middle housing, if we don't have RB or RC, we don't have missing middle, just the straight up definition, we wouldn't have it in our city. RA, even with the increased allowance, does not fit any definition of missing middle housing. Others have outlined this.
It doesn't fit every definition of missing middle, but it's clearly increasing density in a way that is somewhere between single family and 20-unit apartment complexes.
Fair enough, but
Yeah, but I think in our context and given how expensive these are, it's not enough.
and I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, but this,
I can also say that almost every housing coalition and advisory group in the city has been for RB and RC.
Right, and I also say, a lot of the housing coalitions or reports have been based on flat out wrong economic analyses. And I've, in some cases, pointed out the the places where they misquoted some of their economic sources, for example, or quoted them for the exact wrong impression. So the most recent report we got from them, or most recent letter we got from them, was asking us to do all kinds of unspecified things to solve gentrification. And I wrote a letter back to Livable Seaville saying, give me a specific, tell me what you really mean. And of course, only a couple of days ago, I'm not expecting they would have responded right away. But the point is that, we have a lot of political rhetoric out there, and I know I'm running afoul of a lot of political rhetoric at the moment. But just because there are a group of people out there who are arguing for it doesn't make it right.
Well, I'll finish, but again, if missing middle is a goal, it is a thing that has a definition. RB and C is the only thing that is that. To your point, it is fair and true, RA would be an increase in density. I think it's not, I'm interested in getting the best possible policy. I don't care about the political rhetoric. I don't have any incentive to care about it, for better or good. And I do think RB and RC is accomplishing a real policy goal that will get built. And it's a very specific type of housing that you won't see in R1 or anything that's higher intensity, particularly anything above 5 stories because of the change of construction materials, land costs, et cetera. And that's the only way we're going to get any legal ability to build housing that could be middle income affordable rentals. I mean, I'll share my own perspective. I mean, I'm the only renter on council. I don't know how long it's been since there's been a non-homeowner on council. People of my age, it is, I think, the norm that nobody has it doesn't even enter their mind that they're going to become a homeowner in Charlottesville. It's just not a thing. It's this tool that takes us a little closer to get there. That said, I mean, I think it's easy to oversell. It's not going to be transformative, especially for people who are working class, lower middle class, but it's a real policy tool. And anyway, I think it would be a mistake to eliminate it. I think following the Arlington model is a way to kind of square the circle a little bit and address some of the concerns about metering. That's where I fall, and not to introduce more messiness into it, but I also think when it comes to RA, B, C, we might do well to have an SUP process for developments that are 100% deeply affordable, just because that is so site and context specific. Our nonprofit partners in a situation like the Maca Park Street project can very easily end up in a situation where we've actually tied our hands more without them having an SUP process for a project like that to pursue something that's very unique in terms of the funding and site they're able to line up. But that's, and my final thought is, I think with RABC, I still see there's legitimacy to arguments that some of what has been labeled RB or RC, there's an internal logic within the plan, but if you walk that street, it is fairly arbitrary in terms of existing conditions. I could see there being room for change, particularly around that question of areas with high percentage of low-income renters, that dynamic. But I don't know I have not figured out any way to approach that in a way that is systematic and coherent, because it would also seem to be a mistake to just be basically making arbitrary decisions that aren't based on any coherent logic.
Sensitive communities.
Let's just forget about that. Yeah, that's what I would, but let's forget about that for now.
So,
Go ahead, please.
well, so I was just gonna kind of sum up what I think are kind of the key areas that we've been discussing relative to our A, B, and C, and see if that helps us, move along the conversation. So.
Mr. Freeze, Mr. Mayor, could I just? There's been a great deal of talk about residential versus commercial and the goal of bringing in residential folks. There's been a separate discussion about the need for lower barriers for commercial, and that and certainly in the earlier illustrations that we heard, how that might work, you know, the bodega, the coffee house, et cetera. At one point, there was a mention of perhaps some limits of commercial activity, limited number of SUPs for commercial activity. I would just suggest to you, and I want to go back and do some more research myself, that I want to lower expectations a little bit on that this idea that someone could apply for an SUP and that SUP could be denied based on, well, there's just too much commercial here. When you have an SUP, it's pretty fundamental principle in land use law that SUP has to be decided on the basis of land use criteria. Now, to the idea that, well, you don't have to worry about three coffee houses on a block. You may not have to worry about that because of market forces, but overall commercial, a coffee shop, a bodega, a small restaurant. If you get into the discussion of if you were to pass this and you're hearing SUP applications saying there's just too much commercial here, might lead to a successful challenge of a denial of an SUP because it's not based on land use principles, it's based on other factors. So there's been enough talk about SUPs. I hesitated to make this observation, but given the discussion about SUPs, do think about the fact that if you allow SUPs and there is a compelling argument to be made, you would be hard pressed, I think, to say we're going to deny it because we don't want to give up any more space to residential. We just want the commercial. So I hope that's clear. I just think
But you have to be,
you find yourself in a situation.
you have to be careful in what you say and what you do, and they have to be consistent, and there has to be policy and procedure within the realm of the whole legalism, and that's the purpose. You can't just say A and then you do B. So you've got to understand the implications of what you're doing, and it just can't be because I'm your friend, you're going to grant my SUP, but I'm your enemy and you're going to say no.
Precisely, and the idea that you can have a situation, particularly with respect to the SUPs for commercial uses. Once you allow that, council has a great deal of discretion to grant or deny SUPs. But at that point, the criteria that you are left with are land use criteria.
Would, similar to housing, would adverse neighborhood impacts be a legitimate reason in terms of evaluating approval or denial on the part of?
So that's an excellent question. So to some extent, the balance between commercial and residential could lead to concerns, could lead to land use concerns that are very much sort of neighborhood impact concerns. And the only one I can think of, and it's a terrible example in this context, but I come from a much more suburban community, is you don't say we don't want commercial, you say this leads to excess traffic, which leads to safety concerns, which leads us to deny the special use permit. Now, so it's that kind of thing. So yes, Councilor Payne, you can get to those kinds of concerns that are legitimate reasons, but it's through the land use path, not through we're making a determination that at this point, even though allowed by SUP, no more commercial here because we think there's too much.
Right. No,
Makes
thank you.
My own view is if I had to give up commercial, I mean, I don't think we should, but if I had to give it up because it raises all of these other concerns, I would give it up to keep the missing middle type.
Well, that's your first priority.
Right, and so I feel a little bit like all this talk about commercial, I get it, this sort of the creeping, we're gonna have ones. I don't think it's gonna actually happen, I think the concerns are overblown, but okay, that's fine. But I think that's a little bit of, it's important in its own way, and on its own terms, but I think the larger question is, are we committed to what, when I ran for council, I thought everyone was on board with, kind of like the school, this sort of housing in our city. And, I'm not sure that, all the bonuses for affordable housing, I'd be interested in talking about some of that. Maybe those are a little too large, I don't know, but I think the concept, you guys are telling me down here that the notion of missing middle is sort of a thing that you can identify in the housing products. I think
But that was the purpose of the proposed ordinance to begin to eliminate the missing middle. It's not gonna be eliminated tomorrow. And I mean, so, next in 2025, you build 50 units of missing middle. Okay. But you may not build anymore until 2030. But at least you got 50, because you don't have any now.
So I wonder, Lloyd, how receptive are you to the notion of a metering type? We're going to only allow 20 permits a year.
Well,
Would that assuage some of your concerns?
My-
Or it feels like a more fundamental.
my broader concern with that, and I guess, part of it, and I will confess to sort of going around in circles on some of this stuff, because to a certain.
It's okay, we all are.
Because to a certain extent, as we emphasize one piece of this over another piece, the answer changes. And when we start talking, for example, about the making more commercial activity in these kinds of neighborhoods, I fundamentally think we have to increase the density before it's going to be worth anybody talking about economic activity.
That makes sense.
And that if we're going to end up, if we increase the density and take out the commercial piece, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, somebody could add in the commercial piece. But that will never happen, and those will never be affordable or never be sustainable commercially without the increased density.
I'd support that.
And so when you start going into talking about commercial activity in residential zones, that's an example of something that is a political hot potato, as we've seen, maybe would not in the next 10 or 15 years be built in any case. I don't know, but I just.
I personally do think we would be making a policy, not political or rhetoric, but a policy mistake if we structured it to say that if you want to build any commercial, that is illegal and there's no mechanism to do it. Because we do have some examples of it being successful. I think there's areas where people would want it, it would work. You can look at towns in the Northeast that have that pattern of commercial and residential development.
And it's part of what makes that density work while getting people out of their cars that are not driving everywhere, right?
I hear you guys, and I think that's my heart is with you, but I think we're gonna have to sort of, whether we like it or not, prioritize our policy goals is all I can say. If we want to call it political or whatever, I would like to reach something close to consensus on council.
Well, I think so. The SUP discussion, is a dramatic drawback of what was originally on the table.
And from a political sense, and I agree honestly with you. I think honestly, the whole commercial thing is a distraction. I think it's nice. I think it's good. I don't think much of it is going to happen because it's not going to be commercially viable in many places for years. But do you think that the folks who are making videos of tobacco huts in the middle of Greenbrier are going to be mollified by you getting rid of all of the retail in the R zones? No, they're using it as a cudgel to drum up this moral panic about vape shops, because the actual moral panic is about family size housing that is relatively affordable, right? And to your point earlier about what's going to really make the difference, it's a couple hundred units a year, right, at best, hopefully. That is a lot. According to CARS reports, there are 543 houses sold in the city last year. So if we can add 250 units a year,
That's not been the prediction, but.
I mean, that's what the, report said. I think the report was high, but even 100 is a 20% increase in supply on the market. And for once, there are new units coming in, around the middle of the market, and maybe below because of the form, versus either being new units at the extreme top of the market or very old falling apart units at the middle of the market, which is rapidly rising through 500,000 and higher.
Well, I'm want to sort of bring this back around, that this commercial thing is fractional and at the edges of the entire process, and it's a political hot potato. But I think that the political consequences of preserving it are minimal, because what happens? Well, they don't get built in the way the Chicken Littles who were terrified of that, it doesn't happen. So the consequence doesn't eventuate. So what? It didn't happen. Yes, I know it's challenging, I know that, but they're not going to be 104, bodegas going up in 18 months. You're going to have 4, perhaps.
Maybe.
And if we put rules, but I do feel very strongly, so if we're talking about RA, I think exclusive commercial needs to be off the table. If it's RA, it's residential. We have a problem with the number of housing units. And I don't want to give up one scrap of dirt to some commercial enterprise that does not have a residential component. I just think that's, there might be some SUP circumstances where it makes incredible sense. But in general, if you're an RA lot, I want a bedroom, a bathroom, and a kitchen in that place. Period. Now, if you want to put a dentist's office in front of that, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm good. That makes sense.
And if you want to do something that's purely commercial, that is way outside what our intentions are. And you've got to come up with a really, really, really good reason why that's going to be that way. And if we set that as the baseline standard for RA, I think we avoid most of these problems in RA. In RB, I agree with Rory on this, that we are in a position where you can't build housing without building housing. You can't build 8-unit buildings without having 8-unit buildings inside your city. And we need them. And they got to go somewhere. We're not building in the floodplain. So there you go.
I think the other
Which we should build. It's no.
We're not building in the floodplain, let it go.
So.
I will say that if, folks get a chance to go through the commercial uses, going through the use table, there are really not that many kind of uses that are allowed. And we've already talked about cutting them significantly in terms of square footage. They all have an asterisk beside it, use standard supply, or it's a special use permit. So I would think we could craft some kind of, if we wanted to make it even more onerous, I suppose is the word, we could, like Michael is saying, make a more robust SUP process for any kind of commercial activity in the area. But to me, again, even though I think there's value in it, and I see y'all's points about the sort of organicity of it all, and it's a virtuous cycle of so forth. The key thing to me is if we're going to try to keep this particular type of housing product, this missing middle, that's the thing I'm most interested in.
I think that's what everybody's interested in.
Fair enough. And in terms of people who are concerned, that's both pro and con. That is the substantive debate, really.
And so I'm just wondering, is there much more point in this sort of discussion until we on council sort of agree how we feel about it, or are we just kind of
Spinning in circles.
talking? Because I think there's a fundamental, and I respect it, there's a fundamental feeling with the mayor's part. It sounds like the rest of us may be in a little different area, but I think that we're gonna have to have some conversations one-on-one about how we feel about this. And I'm not really sure that dragging this out is gonna it's been very helpful, but I'm not sure there's more.
Yeah, I think we've got it, I believe we've got an unconscious and dying quadruped in the middle of the room here, and we're beating it.
Mr. Freeze, would you describe the quadruped, please?
So we've had a lot of conversation on the commercial, but I want to come back to the comments that have been made about the residential aspect of this, because there have been a number of ideas. Here's what I've captured. One is further limiting the footprint. And I'm focused on the footprint, but this is getting to the overall size of the buildings. The push and pull there is, on the one hand, reducing the scale of the buildings that can be built in the RA, B, and C. The other hand is trying to do so in a way that doesn't preclude the family size units, because I think Rory has correctly pointed out, one of our objectives in neighborhood settings is to create units that are family oriented. That's as opposed to singles and young couples. Like the objective there is in fact family oriented.
How large is that in your view?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's what at least, I mean, I'm thinking like trying to accommodate at least 3-bedroom scale.
1,000 square feet?
Could be 1,200 square feet. Right. And that's RA, RB, and RC. So that's one piece. Then there's the idea that's come up a number of times about rationing the number of permits in some manner. We talked about geographically by assigning them to assigning certain types of units to corner lots. We've also talked about the Arlington model, which is just straight up permit caps on an annual basis. That's something that Jay and I have already started to talk about. It's the challenge there is that there's no clear legal pathway on that, except that Arlington has done it twice now. And interestingly, it's not something they've ever been challenged on, even in the challenge that they have in front of them today. It's the one aspect of their ordinance that was proposed that wasn't actually challenged. So that's something Jay and Sharon and I will be putting our heads together on more, particularly if there's a strong interest in that idea of an annual cap. Then there is the idea of actually reducing the extent on the map of the RB and the RC. Councilor Payne's point, very well taken, that we would want to do that in a way that is systematic, right? And if there is a strong sense that we should be doing that in direction, I can easily come up with a systematic way of doing that. I just need a statement that says, go and do that. I mean, just off the top of my head, I would try and do it in a way that is also equal, right? One of the principles that came out of the comprehensive planning process, the affordable housing plan, was that each part of the city would be accommodating some aspect of medium intensity. I wouldn't want to go in and then say, okay, we're going to take medium intensity out of this entire quadrant of the city, right? So there's an equality notion to that. And then I would probably just take road types and cut it back that way. I.e. take RB and RC just to more primary streets.
Is that?
I'm not suggesting it, I'm just saying that's how we get to something that is systematic and.
No, that's not at all the criteria I was suggesting. I was just suggesting, I think it's clear. There are areas where you could reasonably make an adjustment. I don't know what the systematic way to do it. I haven't given it much thought.
But we want to do it systematically, and I'm throwing out what's off the top of my head as systematic approaches that are also consistent with some of the concerns I've heard from the community as well. And then the issue around subdivision, which I think is the biggest issue there, is what is the minimum size, minimum lot size available for subdivision. So those are kind of my four.
I would be very interested in knowing about shrinking or changing the criteria for the MIR areas.
The RB and the RC.
Yeah, seems like the logic that we used already to get the form to the zoning map was pretty consistent.
Yeah, so it's a question of, do we reduce the extent as presented on the land use map itself?
I understand, but the logic that you had in terms of how you did it around the street types and the, feet away. I don't know, I guess this is just like, put our finger in the air, let's reduce it by 10%. Is that the idea or?
That's not what I'm suggesting. No, I think it's identifying a systematic way of doing it. But the main principle that I would want to maintain is that we're doing it.
I guess
There's
all I
a
would
sense
ask
that they're still reasonably equal across.
I don't want to do a whole lot of like changing of the maps. I'd be interested in what your logic ends up being.
Okay.
Like, we could, I think a chance to sort of argue or discuss what is the most appropriate. I mean, if you could present us with some options.
I just think it's important for us to, whatever we do, that the rationale is that it is the good, best policy, not that this is trying to achieve some political aim. Because quite frankly, I think there are people who are acting in bad faith, and no matter what we do, it's not going to change it. At the same time, I want to acknowledge it's too easy for us to say that everybody who has concerns is acting in bad faith, which is absolutely not true. But I don't want us to make a decision that is not based on a sound policy rationale.
I guess my only point is, I doubt he's going to come up with a sound policy rationale to determine the areas. I mean, maybe you will, but I think it's going to come down to what's practical and feasible and makes some sense in some way. Anyway.
Most emails per capita is technically systematic.
Well, that's what you want to avoid.
Yeah.
If we did that, then it would not be equal across the entire city.
And we, council's fault, earlier in the process, that did happen. Without a clear policy rationale, areas were taken out.
I see what you're saying. I will say that I have not walked every area, Mr. Mayor, but I have been driving around carefully multiple times with my zoning map. About 40% of the way through the city and marking it off with a marker whenever I get.
Sorry, Councilman, you were behind the wheel with the map.
Stopping, I'm very careful.
He goes to
While
the
watching a
street,
YouTube video.
he goes to the street, he parks and he gets out.
I
and he
can see
walks
the tobacco
around.
hut right there.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to plan my scooter routes.
No, he's on the street, he parks and he gets out and he walks
The one thing
around.
I will say is that I've not seen an RB or RC area
Yes.
that you couldn't build something bigger on. I mean, true, if you loaded up every lot with a maximum area, it would not be a good thing, but that's not going to happen. And so, yeah, I haven't seen a place so far that I was like, are you guys crazy? There's no way this.
I mean, they're not going to happen. I mean, if you want to preserve your neighborhood and you're an RB and RC, and you say, I don't want a bunch of RVs on my, I don't want an RV at where I live, don't sell your house.
I would entertain a motion at this time.
You would.
I would.
I have one.
Please take that motion.
I'll move
it. So.
We did not get to module 3.
Sorry.
Yes, on the, I know, and this, you can follow this under, I don't really have anything on this, other than sometimes things are more disjointed than you think they are. So today is the International Day of the Rock. It is also.
In orange?
Huh?
Wait.
Yeah, the actor. Wayne Johnson.
No.
No.
As in the stone.
An actual rock
It
that
is
I will
also-
throw through a window and break the glass.
And it is also, as Lori would be grateful to know, this Embrace Your Geekness Day. However, although it is both of these, National Geologist Day is April 7th. We ought to contemplate this as we adjourn.
Are we gonna talk about Airbnbs at some point?
So I did have that on the list.
We
But
can
there was a motion made. You guys need to
Yeah,
follow.
so
No,
through.
you're a second.
It's 8 o'clock.
I would second that motion.
I hear a second. All in
Needs to
favor?
be-
Aye, all against nay. If you want to stay on, speak out here.
I'm sorry, what was your?
All in favor, aye, all against nay at this time, please. Aye.
Rory has to go
Let us please
back.
continue these conversations in the future. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.
Yeah, man.
4 AM.
Keep in mind that tomorrow is National Pandemonium Day.
Oh, my God.
Also National Mac and Cheese Day.
Yo, oh, now I gotta go home and make some mac
Today
and
is National
cheese.
French Fry Day.
I saw
When,
that. I did see
tomorrow?
that.
Today is French Fry Day.
You missed it.
It's Friday. I'm one of the assessors.
Which I am here.
There you go. Yeah, you know, if I am, I just.